This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. It was a Tuesday morning when I first noticed something was off. I was rushing to get ready for work, coffee in hand, keys jingling as I approached my front door. As I went to lock up, the key wouldn't turn. I tried again and again, growing increasingly frustrated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it clicked into place. I brushed it off as just another annoyance in my hectic morning routine. But looking back, that was the moment everything started to unravel. Over the next few days, I kept having issues with my locks. Sometimes they'd work fine, other times they'd stick or feel different somehow. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something just felt wrong. I started to get this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach every time I came home. One night, I swear I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. I froze in terror, barely breathing, straining to listen. But then, nothing. Just silence. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of my recent divorce was getting to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I started double and triple checking my locks before bed. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I'd heard something. But every time I'd search the house, there was never anything out of place. About a week after the lock issues started, I came home to find my back door unlocked. I know I'd locked it that morning, I always do. That was when the real fear set in. I called a locksmith right away and had all my locks changed. For a few days, things seemed better. But then the problems started again. Keys not working, locks feeling different. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was I imagining things? Had the divorce really messed me up this badly? I confided in a friend, and she suggested I install a security camera. I was hesitant at first. It felt like admitting defeat, like I was letting my paranoia win. But eventually, I gave in. I set up a small camera in my living room, angled towards the front door. The first couple nights, nothing happened. I almost felt silly for installing it. But on the third night, that's when my worst fears were confirmed. I woke up to a notification on my phone. The camera had detected movement. With shaking hands, I opened the app and watched the footage. And there he was, my ex-husband, creeping through my living room in the dead of night. I felt like I was going to be sick. How long had this been going on? What had he done while I was sleeping? My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as he methodically removed the lock from my front door. He replaced it with a new one, pocketed the old lock, and left as silently as he'd come. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I called the police. They took my statement and reviewed the footage. They seemed concerned, but I could tell they didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation. To them, it was just a domestic dispute gone too far. To me, it was my worst nightmare come to life. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and sleepless nights. They managed to track down my ex using neighborhood surveillance cameras. When they brought him in for questioning, he broke down and confessed everything. He'd been coming into my house for weeks, sometimes just to look around, sometimes to move things slightly out of place. He said he wanted me to feel unsettled, to make me doubt myself. The lock switching was his way of maintaining control, of reminding me that he could get to me whenever he wanted. Hearing all of this, I felt violated in a way I can't even describe. My home, the one place I was supposed to feel safe, had been invaded over and over again. The thought of him standing over me while I slept, It still makes me sick to my stomach. In the aftermath, I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Every creak, every shadow made me jump. I'd wake up in cold sweats, convinced he was there. Even though I knew he was in custody, the fear wouldn't leave me. I ended up moving across town to a small apartment in a secure building. I changed my routine, my phone number, everything. But even now, months later, I still find myself checking the locks obsessively. I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, sure that I've heard someone in my home. The physical danger may be gone, but the psychological scars remain. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. How do you rebuild your sense of security when it's been shattered so completely? I'm sharing this because I want others to trust their instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't let anyone gaslight you into thinking you're crazy or paranoid. Your safety and peace of mind are too important. And to anyone who's been through something similar, you're not alone. It's a long road to recovery, but we'll get there. One day at a time, one locked door at a time. I still don't understand why he did it. What was he hoping to achieve? Did he enjoy knowing he was terrorizing me? These are questions I'll probably never have answers to, and maybe that's for the best. For now, I'm focusing on healing, on reclaiming my sense of safety and autonomy. It's not easy, but I'm determined to not let this experience define me. I refuse to live in fear forever. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering what would have happened if I hadn't installed that camera. How long would it have gone on? What would he have escalated to next? The possibilities haunt me, but then I remind myself that I did catch him, that I trusted my instincts and took action, and in doing so, I took back control. It may not feel like it some days, but that was the first step in my journey to recovery. I know the road ahead is long, and there will be good days and bad days. But I'm hopeful. Hopeful that one day I'll be able to walk into my home without that twinge of fear. That I'll be able to sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. Until then, I'll keep moving forward, keep healing, keep fighting, because that's all any of us can do in the face of trauma. Keep going, one day at a time. To anyone reading this who might be in a similar situation, trust yourself, take precautions, reach out for help. You're stronger than you know, and you don't have to face this alone. And remember, healing isn't linear. Some days will be harder than others, but every day you get through is a victory. Hold on to that. As for me, I'm taking it one day at a time, learning to trust again, both others and myself. It's a slow process, but I'm getting there, and that's something no one can take away from me. I never thought I'd be the person living in constant fear and paranoia, but here I am. It all started about 3 months ago on what seemed like a normal Tuesday. I had just gotten home from my bartending shift around 2 a.m., exhausted as usual. All I wanted was to crash in bed, but something felt off as soon as I walked through the door. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The house looked the same. Nothing was obviously missing or out of place, but there was this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right. I did a quick walkthrough of the rooms, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Everything seemed fine until I got to the kitchen. That's when I noticed it. The window above the sink was slightly ajar. I always keep that window locked, especially when I'm gone all night for work. My heart started racing as I realized someone must have been in my house. I grabbed a knife from the counter and searched every room, but there was no sign of an intruder. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, there wasn't much they could do. No forced entry, Nothing stolen, no fingerprints. They took a report, but basically told me to be more careful about locking up. I felt so unsettled that night, jumping at every little sound. I barely slept a wink. The next day, I installed a new deadbolt on the kitchen window and checked all the other locks obsessively. I tried to convince myself it was a one-time thing, maybe just some kids messing around. But deep down, I knew something more sinister was going on. A week went by, and I started to relax a little. Then it happened again. This time I came home to find muddy footprints on the kitchen floor. Someone had definitely been inside while I was at work. I called the police again, but it was the same story. No real evidence, no leads. I was beyond freaked out at this point. Who was coming into my house and why? What were they looking for? I started leaving work early, varying my schedule, anything to try and catch them in the act. But they always seemed to know when I'd be gone. It wasn't until about a month in that I finally discovered what they were up to. I had taken a rare day off and was up in the attic looking for some old winter clothes when I stumbled upon it, a small electronic device, carefully hidden behind some boxes. I had no idea what it was, but I knew it didn't belong to me. I took it to a tech-savvy friend, and he confirmed my worst fears. It was some kind of signal booster or Wi-Fi extender. Someone was using my house as a base for God knows what kind of illegal online activity. The realization made me sick to my stomach. Back to the police I went, device in hand. They took it more seriously this time, but still couldn't track down who was responsible. They said it was likely part of a larger hacking operation, using residential houses as cover. Great. So not only was I dealing with a break-in, but potentially dangerous criminals too. From that point on, I became obsessed with security. I installed motion sensors on every window and door. I got cameras for inside and outside the house. I changed every password I had and started using a VPN. I even considered moving, but the idea of starting over somewhere new was overwhelming. The invasion stopped after that, or at least I think it did, but the damage was done. I live in a constant state of hypervigilance now. Every creak of the house, every notification on my phone sets me on edge. I find myself checking and rechecking the locks multiple times a night. My friends tell me I need to relax, that lightning doesn't strike twice. But they don't understand. Once you've had your sense of safety and privacy violated like that, you can never go back. I'm always wondering, are they watching me? Will they come back? Have they moved on to another unsuspecting victim? I've become that person who jumps at shadows, who sees threats around every corner. I hate what this has done to me, how it's changed me, but I don't know how to stop. The fear has become a part of me now. Sometimes I think about quitting my job, finding something with normal hours so I'm not leaving the house empty at night. But then I wonder, is that what they want? For me to completely upend my life? I refuse to give them that satisfaction. So I stay, I work, I try to live some semblance of a normal life. But it's all a facade. Inside, I'm constantly on alert, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every time I come home, there's that moment of dread before I open the door. Will this be the day I find them inside? Or worse, will they be waiting for me? I've started having nightmares about faceless intruders. In my dreams, I'm always too late, always one step behind. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I've heard someone in the house. It takes hours to calm down enough to sleep again. The worst part is the not knowing. Who were they? What exactly were they doing? Are they still out there planning their next move? The police say there haven't been any similar cases reported, but that doesn't make me feel better. It just makes me wonder why I was targeted. I've become a regular at the hardware store, always adding new locks, new alarms, anything to feel a little safer. The employees probably think I'm crazy, but I don't care. They haven't lived through what I have. My dating life has taken a hit too. How do you explain to someone why you need to check every room before you can relax? Why you flinch at unexpected noises? I've stopped inviting people over altogether. My house doesn't feel like a home anymore. It's a fortress, a prison of my own making. There are moments when I think about packing it all in, selling the house and starting fresh somewhere new. But then the paranoia kicks in again. What if they follow me? What if the next place is even less secure? At least here, I know every inch, every potential entry point. I've started seeing a therapist, trying to work through some of this anxiety. She says it's a normal response to trauma, that it will take time to feel safe again. But how can I ever feel safe when I know how easy it is for someone to invade your space, your life? The rational part of my brain knows that the chances of it happening again are slim, but the fear doesn't listen to reason. It's always there, whispering worst-case scenarios, making me double and triple check everything. I find myself watching my neighbors now, wondering if they've experienced anything similar. Are their homes being used too? Should I warn them? But how do you even start that conversation without sounding completely unhinged? Sometimes I think I see unfamiliar cars parked on the street, or catch glimpses of someone watching the house. But when I look again, there's nothing there. Am I imagining things now? Has the fear completely taken over? I've considered reaching out to other victims of home invasions, trying to find some solidarity or understanding. But every time I start to type out my story, I stop. Putting it into words makes it all too real, too raw. So here I am, 3 months later, living a life I barely recognize. My once cozy home now feels like a fortress, my once carefree spirit replaced by constant vigilance. I tell myself it will get better with time, that eventually the fear will fade. But deep down, I'm not sure I believe it. Every day is a battle between the person I used to be and this new paranoid version of myself. I want so badly to feel normal again, to not flinch at every sound or shadow. But I don't know how to bridge that gap. For now, I take it one day at a time. I go to work, I come home, I check every lock and sensor. I try to find small moments of peace, of normalcy. But always, there's that undercurrent of fear, that knowledge that my sanctuary was violated and can be again. This is my life now, forever changed by a faceless intruder and a small electronic device. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover, ever feel truly safe again. But I'm trying. God, I'm trying. Because the alternative, letting the fear win completely, is unthinkable. So I keep going, keep fighting, hoping that someday, somehow, I'll find my way back to feeling secure in my own home. That evening, as I was grading papers at the kitchen table, I kept hearing odd noises, little thumps and creaks that I'd never noticed before. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the house settling or the wind outside, but something felt off. I couldn't shake this eerie feeling of being watched. My cat Luna seemed on edge too. She kept staring intently at the wall near the entryway, her tail twitching. At one point she let out a low growl, which was unlike her. I got up to investigate, but didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. Still, goosebumps prickled on my arms. I had trouble falling asleep that night. Every little sound made me jump. I tossed and turned for hours before finally drifting off into a restless sleep. I woke up exhausted the next morning, my nerves still on edge. The day dragged on at school. I was distracted and kept zoning out during lessons. My students definitely noticed something was off, but I brushed off their concerned looks. By the time the final bell rang, I just wanted to get home and relax. As soon as I walked in the front door that afternoon, Luna came running up to me, meowing urgently. She led me straight to the entryway closet, pawing at the baseboard. My heart started racing. With shaking hands, I pushed aside the coats and crouched down to take a closer look. That's when I saw it, a tiny gap where the baseboard met the wall, just big enough for a mouse, or for someone to peer through. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling. This had to be my imagination running wild, right? But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. With trembling fingers, I called my neighbor Mike, who's pretty handy with home repairs. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked if he could come take a look at some odd wiring in my closet. Mike arrived about 20 minutes later. I nervously explained what I'd been hearing and showed him the gap in the baseboard. He examined it closely, then started feeling along the wall. Suddenly, he paused. "Hey, does this section of wall feel different to you?" he asked. I ran my hand over the spot he indicated. The texture did seem slightly off compared to the surrounding area. Mike tapped it gently, and we both heard a hollow sound. "I think there might be a false wall here," he said quietly. "Want me to open it up?" I nodded, my mouth dry. Mike went out to his truck to grab some tools. When he returned, he carefully pried off a section of the baseboard, revealing a seam in the drywall. With growing dread, I watched as he cut along the seam. The section of wall swung open like a door, exposing a cramped, pitch-black space behind it. The musty smell that wafted out made me gag. Mike shone his flashlight inside, and we both gasped. Crammed into the tiny space was a sleeping bag, some empty food wrappers, and a few articles of clothing. It looked like someone had been living in there. I stumbled backwards, my legs giving out. Mike caught me before I hit the ground. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Someone's been living in my walls?" Mike immediately called the police while I sat there in shock, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police officers swarmed my house, dusting for prints and examining every inch of the hidden space. They confirmed that someone had indeed been living there, possibly for weeks or even months. But there was no sign of the intruder. I answered their questions in a daze, barely able to string together coherent sentences. How long had this person been there? Had they been watching me? The thought made my skin crawl. As the investigation wrapped up, an officer gently suggested I stay with a friend or family member for a few days while they continued searching for the culprit. I nodded numbly and called my sister to come pick me up. That night at my sister's house, I barely slept a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined a stranger silently creeping through my home while I slept unaware. The violation of my personal space, my sanctuary, left me feeling utterly vulnerable. Over the next few days, I worked with the police and a home security company to completely seal off the hidden space and install motion sensors throughout my house. Logically, I knew the intruder was long gone, but I couldn't shake the paralyzing fear. It's been weeks now, and I still jump at every little sound. I've had countless nightmares about waking up to find a stranger standing over my bed. Some nights I don't sleep at all, instead sitting up with all the lights on, clutching Luna close. I've debated selling the house and moving, but the thought of starting over somewhere new is overwhelming. This was supposed to be my forever home, the charming old fixer-upper I'd dreamed of. Now it feels tainted, no longer the safe haven it once was. My friends and family have been incredibly supportive, but they can't truly understand the bone-deep fear I'm living with. How do you ever feel safe again, knowing that someone invaded your most private space without you even realizing? The police still haven't found any leads on who the intruder might have been or how long they were living in my walls. Part of me doesn't want to know the details. I'm not sure I could handle it. But the not knowing is its own kind of torture. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, checking and rechecking that doors and windows are locked. I've become hyper-vigilant, analyzing every little sound or movement. It's exhausting, but I can't seem to let my guard down. Some days are better than others. I'm slowly trying to reclaim my space, to convince myself that my home is truly mine again. But then I'll catch a glimpse of that sealed-off section of wall, and the fear comes rushing back. I know that rationally, the chances of something like this happening again are incredibly slim. But the knowledge that it happened once has shattered my sense of security. Will I ever truly feel safe in my own home again? Only time will tell. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time, seeing a therapist to work through the trauma, leaning on my support system, and desperately hoping that someday this will all feel like a distant bad dream instead of my daily reality. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. I'm not sure why I felt compelled to share it, maybe in hopes that putting it out there will help me process it all, or maybe as a warning to others to always trust your instincts if something feels off. You never know what might be lurking just out of sight. At first, everything seemed normal. Sure, the house was a bit creaky and drafty, but that's to be expected with these old places. I spent most of my time buried in books and research anyway, so I didn't pay much attention to my surroundings. That all changed one night when I was up late working on a paper. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard a strange scratching sound coming from the basement. My first thought was that it must be mice or something, but as I listened more closely, it sounded bigger, more deliberate. I tried to ignore it and focus on my work, but the noises kept getting louder and more frequent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way down the rickety basement stairs. The beam of light swept across dusty shelves and cobwebbed corners. Everything looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed something odd, a stack of cardboard boxes that I didn't remember being there before. As I got closer, I realized the boxes were filled with all kinds of random items: canned goods, toiletries, cleaning supplies. It was like someone had raided the clearance aisle at a dollar store. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I heard it, footsteps creaking on the floorboards directly above me. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps were moving towards the basement door. In a panic, I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, praying I wouldn't be seen. The door slowly creaked open. A shaft of dim light spilled down the stairs as a dark figure began to descend. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I watched the shadowy form draw closer. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging everything into pitch blackness. I heard a muffled curse and the sound of someone stumbling on the stairs. Then rapid footsteps as the intruder bolted back up and out of the basement. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours, afraid to move a muscle. When I finally worked up the courage to fumble my way back upstairs, I found the front door wide open, swinging in the night breeze. With shaking hands, I called the police. They arrived quickly and searched the property, but found no sign of the intruder. However, they did confirm my fears about the boxes in the basement. It turns out they were full of merchandise stolen from a nearby supermarket over the past few months. The officer told me it looked like someone had been using my basement as a temporary storage spot for their heists. They'd probably been sneaking in and out for weeks without me noticing. I felt sick to my stomach. To think that some stranger had been lurking just below my feet this whole time, coming and going as they pleased. I couldn't wrap my head around it. The next few days were a blur of police statements and sleepless nights. I kept imagining I heard noises, jumping at every little creak or groan of the old house. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the thief wouldn't be stupid enough to come back now that they'd been discovered. But I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, of no longer being safe in my own home. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed. I installed new locks and motion sensor lights. But nothing could erase the knowledge that my privacy had been so thoroughly invaded. The final straw came about a week after the incident. I was doing laundry in the basement when I noticed something poking out from behind the dryer. It was a small notebook, filled with what looked like plans and schedules. Delivery routes for the supermarket, employee shift changes, security patrol timings. Seeing those meticulous notes made it all too real. This wasn't just some random break-in. Someone had been watching, planning, using my home as their personal command center for who knows how long. I couldn't take it anymore. That very day, I started looking for a new place to live. I found a small studio apartment in a secure building with 24/7 surveillance. It costs nearly twice as much as the old house, but it's worth every penny for my peace of mind. It's been a few months now since I moved. The police never caught the person responsible. Sometimes I still have nightmares about shadowy figures creeping through my home. I find myself constantly checking locks and looking over my shoulder. I know logically that I'm safe now, but I don't think I'll ever fully shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that at any moment my sanctuary could be invaded again. The scariest part is how long it went on without me noticing, how oblivious I was to the danger right under my nose. It's made me realize how vulnerable we all are, even in the places we think are safest. I still can't believe it happened to me. Some days it feels like a bad dream, but then I'll catch a glimpse of the headlines about more store robberies in my old neighborhood, and it all comes rushing back. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly secure again, but I'm trying to move forward, one day at a time. I just hope that by sharing my story, maybe I can help someone else avoid going through what I did. Always trust your instincts and never take your safety for granted. You never know what might be lurking just out of sight. I'd been living alone in my little cabin on the outskirts of town for about 5 years at that point. It was peaceful out there, surrounded by pine trees and silence. During the day, I ran my small bookshop in town, but evenings were for curling up by the fire with a good novel and a cup of hot cocoa. I loved the solitude, especially in winter when everything was blanketed in pristine white snow. That night started like any other. I closed up the shop around 6 p.m. as a heavy snowstorm was rolling in. The drive home was treacherous, my old pickup truck fishtailing on the icy roads as fat flakes obscured my vision. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the wind was howling and snow was coming down in thick sheets. I hurried inside, stamping the snow off my boots in the mudroom. The cabin was dark and chilly, so I got a fire going in the wood stove and turned on some lamps. Outside my windows, all I could see was a wall of white as the blizzard raged. I heated up some leftover chili for dinner and settled in with my latest mystery novel, grateful to be safe and warm inside while nature unleashed its fury. Around 10 p.m., I was just thinking about heading to bed when I heard it. A sharp, distinct knock at the front door. 3 raps in quick succession. I froze, my body instantly flooded with adrenaline. Who the hell could be out in this storm? And how did they even make it up my long, unplowed driveway? "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. No response. Heart pounding, I crept to the front door and peered out the peephole. All I could see was swirling snow in the glow of my porch light. No sign of anyone. I told myself I must have imagined it. The wind was fierce. A branch probably hit the door or something. I double-checked that the deadbolt was locked and headed back to the living room. But before I could even sit down, another knock came. This time from the back door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This was no branch. Someone was out there circling my house. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaky. "I'm armed." A lie, but they didn't need to know that. Silence, just the roar of the wind. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer and cautiously approached the back door. The small window was fogged with condensation. I wiped it clear with my sleeve and shone the light out into the yard. Nothing but white. But wait, there, at the edge of the beam. Footprints, fresh ones, leading away from the door and disappearing into the whiteout conditions. My breath caught in my throat. This was really happening. Someone was out there, stalking around my house in the middle of a blizzard. I ran from window to window, desperately trying to catch a glimpse of the intruder. But the storm made it impossible to see more than a few feet. Another knock, this time at my bedroom window. I yelped and dropped the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. Scrambling, I found my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. It rang and rang, but no one picked up. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. I was on my own. For the next 2 hours, the knocking continued. Sometimes it was soft taps, other times violent pounding that rattled the windows. It moved around the house in no discernible pattern. Front door, side window, back door. Over and over. I huddled in the center of the living room, as far from the walls as possible. My eyes darted frantically from one entry point to another, terrified that at any moment a window would shatter or a door would splinter. Why were they doing this? What did they want? The questions raced through my mind, but I had no answers, just overwhelming, paralyzing fear. Around 1 a.m., the knocking abruptly stopped. The silence was almost as unnerving as the noise had been. Had they given up, or were they preparing for something worse? I don't know how long I sat there, barely breathing, straining my ears for any sound. Eventually I realized the wind had died down. The storm was passing. As the faintest hint of pre-dawn light began to creep into the sky, I finally worked up the courage to look outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Footprints, dozens of them, circling my entire house. Some were deep, others just faint impressions. But they formed a complete perimeter around the cabin. Whoever it was had literally been walking circles around me all night long. But that wasn't the strangest part. Leading away from my driveway were 2 parallel lines in the snow, the tracks of a snowmobile. They disappeared into the trees, heading deep into the forest. I slumped against the wall, my legs giving out as the adrenaline finally faded. What the hell had just happened to me? The next few days were a blur. I reported the incident to the police, but with no real evidence beyond footprints, there wasn't much they could do. I installed security cameras and motion sensing lights all around the property, and I bought my first gun, a simple revolver that I now keep on my nightstand. It's been over 5 years, and nothing like that has happened again. But I've never felt truly safe in my home since that night. Every unexplained noise, every shadow in the yard. It all brings me right back to those terrifying hours. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the isolation and the storm played tricks on my mind. But then I look at those security cameras, at that gun by my bed, and I know it was real. Someone was out there that night. Someone who spent hours terrorizing me for reasons I'll never understand. And the worst part is, they're still out there somewhere, waiting, watching. I just pray they never come back. Still can't see my family's faces. It's been 3 months since that day on the frozen lake, but every time I close my eyes, all I see is that endless white expanse and the ghostly figure emerging from the snow. I know I should probably talk to someone about what happened, but who would believe me? Hell, I'm not even sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and I know it saved my life. It was early February, and I decided to go ice fishing despite the blizzard warnings. My dad and I used to go every winter when I was a kid, and after he passed away last year, I felt like I needed to keep the tradition alive. Maybe it was my way of feeling close to him again, I don't know. Looking back, it was a stupid, reckless decision, but grief does funny things to a person's judgment. I packed up my gear early that morning and drove out to Lake Superior. The wind was already whipping snow across the road, and I could barely see 20 feet in front of me. But I'd grown up in Duluth. I was used to harsh winters, or so I thought. By the time I got out onto the ice, the storm had picked up even more. I could barely stand upright against the wind as I trudged out to my usual spot about a quarter mile from shore. The world had shrunk down to a tiny bubble of white all around me. I couldn't even see the shoreline anymore. I set up my portable fishing shelter and got to work drilling my hole. The howling of the wind was deafening, drowning out the sound of my auger. As I worked, I kept getting this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. But every time I looked up, there was nothing but swirling snow in every direction. Finally, I got my lines in the water and hunkered down in my shelter to wait. Hours passed with no bites. The storm showed no signs of letting up. I was starting to think about packing it in when I heard it. A voice carried on the wind. "You shouldn't be here." I nearly jumped out of my skin. I poked my head out of the shelter, squinting against the stinging snow, and that's when I saw him. About 50 yards away stood a man. At least, I think it was a man. He was tall and thin, dressed all in white. His face was obscured by the blowing snow, but I could feel his eyes on me. He raised one arm, pointing at me. "The ice isn't safe. You need to leave, now." His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I blinked, and suddenly he was closer, maybe 30 yards away now. I scrambled out of my shelter, heart pounding. "Who are you?" I shouted over the wind. "How did you get out here?" He didn't answer, just kept pointing at me with that outstretched arm. And then I heard it, a deep groaning sound coming from beneath my feet. I looked down just in time to see a crack forming in the ice, spreading out from where I stood like a spider web. Pure terror jolted through me. I turned and ran, abandoning all my gear. The cracking sound pursued me, gaining ground with every step. I could feel the ice shifting and buckling under my feet. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. My lungs were on fire, legs numb from cold and exertion. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw the shore looming out of the white haze. I staggered the last few yards and collapsed onto solid ground, gasping for breath. When I finally managed to lift my head and look back, I saw nothing but unbroken white. No cracks, no mysterious figure, just the storm, raging on. I sat there for a long time, shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. Who was that man? How did he know the ice was going to break? And where did he go? Eventually, I managed to stumble back to my truck and drive home. I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to make sense of it all. I scoured local news reports, looking for any mention of ice breaks or accidents on the lake. Nothing. I asked around town if anyone else had been out fishing that day. No one had. They all said I was crazy for going out in that storm. I've run through every possible explanation in my mind. Maybe I hallucinated the whole thing, some kind of stress-induced breakdown brought on by grief and isolation. But that doesn't explain the missing fishing gear. I went back out to the lake once the storm cleared, and there was no sign of my shelter or equipment. It's like it all just vanished. Part of me wonders if it was my dad somehow, watching over me from beyond. But that doesn't feel right either. Whatever I saw out there, it wasn't human. Not entirely, anyway. I haven't been back to the lake since that day. I can't bring myself to go near it. Sometimes I dream about it, that endless white expanse, that figure emerging from the snow. In my dreams, I'm not always fast enough to escape the cracking ice. I wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat. I know I should be grateful. Whatever happened out there, it saved my life. But I can't shake this feeling of wrongness, like I glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. A corner of reality pulled back for just a moment, revealing something beyond my understanding. I've thought about moving away from Duluth, trying to put it all behind me. But something keeps me here. Maybe I'm hoping for an explanation, some key that will make it all make sense. Or maybe I'm just afraid that if I leave, I'll be leaving behind the last connection I have to my dad and our shared memories on that lake. All I know is that I'll never look at a frozen lake the same way again. And every time it snows, I find myself searching the white expanse for that tall, thin figure, warning me, watching me, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that day, but I do know this. There are things out there beyond our comprehension, things that lurk in the silence and the snow, and sometimes, if we're lucky, they reach out to save us from dangers we can't see coming. But at what cost? What happens when you've seen behind the curtain, even for just a moment? How do you go back to a normal life after that? I don't have any answers. All I can do is share my story and hope that maybe, somewhere out there, someone else has experienced something similar, that I'm not alone in this, that I'm not going crazy. And if you ever find yourself out on a frozen lake in the heart of winter, and you hear a voice on the wind telling you to leave, don't hesitate, don't question it, just run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back, because some warnings only come once. The ice isn't always as solid as it seems, and sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones we can't see until it's almost too late. I never thought a peaceful weekend getaway could turn into such a terrifying ordeal. It all started when I decided to rent a secluded cabin on Mount Hood for some much-needed rest and relaxation. As a construction worker, my days are filled with noise and chaos, so I was really looking forward to some quiet time alone in nature. When I arrived at the cabin on Friday evening, I was immediately struck by how isolated it was. The gravel driveway wound through dense forest for what felt like miles before finally opening up to a small clearing where the cabin stood. It was a quaint little place, all wooden logs and a rustic front porch. I breathed in the crisp mountain air, and felt my stress start to melt away already. But as soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. The cabin looked tidy enough at a glance, but then I noticed little things that seemed out of place. There were dirty dishes in the sink that definitely weren't mine. The bed was unmade, and when I touched it, the sheets still felt slightly warm, as if someone had just been lying there. A half-empty glass of water sat on the nightstand. I told myself I was being paranoid. The cleaning service must have just missed a few things, that's all. I unpacked my bags and tried to settle in, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. As night fell, the shadows in the cabin seemed to grow longer and darker. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards made me jump. I decided to distract myself by making dinner and having a beer on the porch. The cool night air helped calm my nerves a bit. I gazed up at the stars, so bright and numerous out here away from the city lights. It really was beautiful. Maybe I had just let my imagination run wild earlier. But then, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it. A soft thud coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I froze, straining my ears. For several long moments there was only silence. Then another faint noise. Was that a floorboard creaking? My heart began to race. I told myself it was just the cabin settling. Old houses make noises all the time, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that it sounded an awful lot like footsteps. I barely slept that night. Every tiny sound had me bolt upright in bed, my eyes darting around the darkened room. I could have sworn I heard breathing once, so close it was like someone was standing right next to the bed. But when I turned on the light, there was no one there. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I was up and out of bed. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been all night until I felt my muscles protesting as I moved. I made a beeline for the coffee maker, desperate for some caffeine to clear the fog of my sleepless night. That's when I saw them. Muddy footprints leading from the back door out onto the porch. My blood ran cold. Those definitely hadn't been there the day before. With trembling hands, I opened the back door and peered outside. The footprints continued down the steps and off into the dense underbrush of the forest. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind reeling. Someone had been in the cabin while I was sleeping. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. All those little signs I'd tried to rationalize away suddenly took on a terrifying new meaning. The dirty dishes, the rumpled bed. It wasn't just sloppy housekeeping. Someone had been living in the cabin, and they'd hidden when I arrived. I frantically began packing my things, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip up my bag. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lunging at me from some hidden corner of the cabin. I've never moved so fast in my life as I did loading up my car that morning. As I peeled out of the driveway, my tires kicking up gravel, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I imagined the intruder watching from the tree line as I fled, maybe even now emerging from their hiding place to reclaim the cabin. The thought made me shudder. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the main highway, surrounded by other cars and people. I called the rental company as soon as I had cell service again to report what had happened. They seemed skeptical at first, but promised to send someone out to check on the property. I don't know if they ever found any evidence of the intruder. Part of me doesn't want to know. It's been months since that weekend, but I still have nightmares about it sometimes. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear breathing in the darkness of my bedroom. I've become hyper-vigilant about locking my doors and windows. I don't think I'll ever be able to stay in a remote cabin again. The scariest part is not knowing who was in that cabin or why. Were they just a squatter looking for a free place to crash? Or someone more dangerous, I can't help but imagine all the terrible things that could have happened if they'd decided to confront me instead of sneaking away in the night. I used to love the peace and quiet of nature. Now, the thought of being alone in the wilderness fills me with dread. I keep wondering, if I go somewhere isolated again, how can I ever be sure I'm really alone? That weekend changed me in ways I'm still coming to terms with. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe again. It was late afternoon, and I had been driving for hours along winding mountain roads. The snow was coming down harder, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I probably should have turned back earlier, but I was determined to reach this vista point I'd read about online. As the storm intensified, I realized I had made a huge mistake. My little sedan was struggling in the deepening snow. The tires kept spinning, barely getting any traction. I knew I needed to find somewhere safe to pull over and wait out the storm. But there was nowhere to go, just steep drop-offs on either side of the narrow road. Panic started to set in as I inched forward, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. The wind howled, rocking my car. Snow pelted the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. Finally, I spotted a wider shoulder area and managed to pull over. I let out a shaky breath, realizing how tense I'd been. At least I was off the main road now. I shut off the engine to conserve gas and tried to relax. The silence was eerie. No other cars had passed by in ages. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal up here. I was completely cut off. How long would this storm last? Did anyone know where I was? My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. After about 30 minutes, I saw headlights approaching through the whiteout conditions. Relief washed over me. Maybe it was a snowplow or police vehicle that could help. But as the vehicle got closer, I realized it was just an old pickup truck. It pulled up behind me and stopped. Through my rearview mirror, all I could make out was a dark silhouette in the driver's seat. Why weren't they passing? Maybe they wanted to check if I needed help. I waited, but nobody got out. The truck just idled there, headlights boring into my mirrors. An uneasy feeling started to creep over me. Something didn't feel right about this. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a car door open and slam shut. Footsteps crunched in the snow, getting closer. My heart started racing. Should I lock the doors? But what if they really were just trying to help? A figure appeared at my window, barely visible through the frosted glass. They knocked, making me jump. Hesitantly, I cracked the window a few inches. "You all right in there?" a gruff male voice asked. I could smell cigarette smoke on his breath. Yeah, I'm fine," I stammered. "Just waiting out the storm. Thanks for checking." "Storm's only gonna get worse," the man said. "Why don't you hop in my truck? I can give you a ride to town." Every instinct told me not to trust this stranger. "That's really nice of you, but I think I'll be okay here. I've got plenty of gas and supplies." He was quiet for a moment. "You sure about that? It's going to be a long, cold night out here. My truck's got four-wheel drive. I can have you someplace warm in no time." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I appreciate the offer, but really I'm all set. Thanks anyway." He didn't move away from the window. "Come on now, don't be foolish. It ain't safe out here all alone. Why don't you—" I said no, thank you. I cut him off more forcefully. "Please leave me alone." I started to roll up the window, but he grabbed the edge. "Now listen here." Adrenaline surging, I slammed down the lock button and rolled the window up the rest of the way, nearly catching his fingers. He pounded on the glass, shouting something I couldn't make out. I was shaking uncontrollably. To my horror, instead of leaving, the man went back to his truck. But he didn't drive away. He just sat there, engine idling, headlights glaring at me. I was trapped. Hours crawled by. The storm raged on outside. Every so often I'd hear the man's truck door open and slam shut as he got out to pace around. Sometimes he'd come rap on my window again. I stayed huddled in my seat, ignoring him. My mind raced with terrible possibilities. Was he waiting for me to fall asleep? To run out of gas? What would he do then? I kept the doors locked and my hand on the key, ready to start the engine and try to flee if I had to. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. I ran the car periodically to stay warm, acutely aware of my dwindling gas gauge. The man in the truck showed no signs of leaving. I was exhausted but terrified to sleep. Every time I dozed off, I'd jerk awake in a panic, certain he was trying to break in. The wait became psychological torture. Why wouldn't he just go away? Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I noticed the snowfall finally starting to let up. A faint glow on the horizon told me dawn wasn't far off. Had I actually made it through the night? Suddenly I heard the man's truck roar to life. My whole body tensed. What was he going to do? To my utter disbelief, he simply drove away, disappearing into the swirling snow. Just like that, it was over. I sat in stunned silence, unable to process what had happened. As soon as it was light enough, I got out to clear the snow from my car. My legs were weak and shaky. Every sound made me flinch, convinced the truck was coming back. But the road remained empty. I managed to get the car moving and crawled along at a snail's pace until I reached the main highway. Plows had been through, and I was able to make it into Taos. Desperate for a hot meal and human contact, I stopped at a small diner on the outskirts of town. As the waitress poured my coffee, I hesitantly asked if she'd heard about any stranded motorists during the storm. Her face went pale. "Oh, honey, you're lucky to be alive. There's been talk lately of a man in an old pickup who stops to help people stuck in the snow. But the ones who accept never make it to town, if you know what I mean. Police can't find any proof, but too many folks have gone missing up in those mountains." I felt sick. The full weight of how close I'd come to God knows what hit me like a punch to the gut. I thanked the waitress and quickly left, unable to eat. It's been months now, but I still have nightmares about those endless hours trapped in my car, that menacing truck looming behind me. I can't shake the feeling that if I'd made one wrong move, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Sometimes I wonder, was it really just a kind stranger offering help, and my paranoia got the best of me? But deep down, I know my instincts were right. Whatever that man's intentions were, they weren't good. I don't know why he finally left, or what would have happened if the storm hadn't broken when it did. All I know is I'll never take another winter road trip alone again. And if you find yourself stranded in a snowstorm, for the love of God, don't accept rides from strangers. Around 11 p.m., we pulled over at a small rest stop off the highway. Most of us were half asleep, but I really needed to use the bathroom. As I stepped off the bus, the bitter cold hit me like a wall. The snow was coming down in thick flurries, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I hurried towards the restroom building, head down against the wind. That's when I heard it, a soft, echoing voice calling my name. I looked up, squinting through the snow. There, at the edge of the trees, I saw a faint blue glow. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a figure, shimmering and translucent. My first thought was that I must be dreaming. I rubbed my eyes, but the figure was still there. It called out again, beckoning me closer. Against all logic, I felt drawn to it. My feet started moving of their own accord, trudging through the deepening snow. As I got closer, I could see it more clearly. A woman, I think, with long flowing hair that moved as if underwater. Her skin and clothing were various shades of pale blue and white. She was beautiful, but in an otherworldly, unsettling way. Her eyes were completely white, no pupils or irises. She reached out a hand towards me, still calling softly. I knew I should turn back, but I couldn't look away. It was like I was in a trance. The falling snow seemed to slow down around me. I felt so cold, but also strangely peaceful. I had almost reached her when I felt a hand grab my shoulder, yanking me backwards. I blinked, snapping out of whatever spell I'd been under. It was Coach Miller, looking furious and scared. "What the hell are you doing?" he yelled, barely audible over the howling wind. "Get back on the bus now!" I turned to look back at the woman, but she was gone. There was nothing there but trees and swirling snow. Confused and shaken, I let Coach drag me back to the bus. As we climbed aboard, I realized I was shivering violently. My clothes were soaked through with snow. How long had I been out there? It had felt like only moments, but it must have been several minutes at least. Coach wrapped me in a blanket and sat me down, still looking worried and angry. "You trying to freeze to death out there?" he demanded. "What were you thinking wandering off like that?" I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. It all seemed so hazy and dreamlike already. Had I imagined it? Maybe I'd been sleepwalking or hallucinating from exhaustion, but it had felt so real. The other guys on the team were staring at me. A few asked if I was okay, but I just nodded silently. I didn't know how to describe what had happened. I wasn't even sure myself. As we pulled back onto the road, I kept replaying it in my mind. The glowing figure, the hypnotic voice, the strange calm I'd felt. None of it made sense. I tried to convince myself it had just been my tired mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The next day at the tournament, I was distracted and off my game. I lost my first 2 matches, which had never happened before. Coach pulled me aside, asking what was wrong. I still couldn't bring myself to talk about it. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? That night in the hotel, I overheard some of the local guys talking. They were swapping stories about something called frost ghosts, spirits that supposedly lured people out into blizzards, never to be seen again. My blood ran cold. It sounded exactly like what I'd experienced. I wanted to ask them more, but I was afraid they'd think I was crazy. So I just lay in bed, unable to sleep, going over and over it in my head. What if Coach hadn't grabbed me when he did? Would I have followed that thing into the woods and disappeared forever? The rest of the trip passed in a blur. I managed to win my last match, but my heart wasn't in it. I just wanted to go home and try to forget the whole thing. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of those glowing white eyes and that haunting voice calling my name. I've done some research since then on frost ghosts and similar legends. Apparently, there are stories from all over the world about spirits that lure travelers to their doom in snowstorms. Some say they're the ghosts of people who died in blizzards. Others claim they're some kind of ancient nature spirits. I don't know what to believe. Part of me still wants to write it off as a hallucination or waking dream, but it felt too vivid, too real, and the coincidence with the local legends is hard to ignore. I haven't told many people about this. Even writing it out now, I worry it sounds completely insane. But I know what I saw and felt that night. Something was out there in that snowstorm, something not of this world, and for some reason, it wanted me. I still wrestle, but I get nervous whenever we have away matches in snowy areas. I find myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see that blue glow again. So far, nothing. But I can't shake the feeling that it's out there somewhere, waiting. If you're ever driving through a snowstorm and see a strange light in the woods, or hear a voice calling you, don't follow it. No matter how drawn to it you feel, fight the urge. Get back in your car or get inside somewhere safe. Because there are things out there in the blizzard that we can't explain. Things that want to take us away to places we were never meant to go. I was lucky. Coach saved me that night. But I can't help wondering how many others weren't so fortunate. How many people have vanished into the snow, lured away by those haunting voices and ethereal lights. It chills me to think about. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened to me that night. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe there's a rational explanation I haven't thought of. But deep down, I know the truth. I came face to face with something beyond our world, and only by sheer luck did I escape to tell the tale. So be careful out there in the winter wilderness, and if you ever find yourself drawn to a strange glow in a snowstorm, fight it with everything you have. Your life may depend on it, because the frost ghosts are real, and they're always hunting for new souls to claim. It started when I got a call from this couple, Richard and Pamela, about a job at their place. They lived in this old house on the outskirts of town, you know, one of those creaky Victorian places that looks like it belongs in a horror movie. When I arrived, Richard explained they wanted me to search for some gold coins supposedly buried under the house. Sounded easy enough, right? Man, was I wrong. I headed down to the crawl space with my metal detector, expecting a quick and boring search. The musty smell hit me as soon as I ducked under the house. Cobwebs clung to my hair and shirt as I shuffled through the narrow space. After about an hour of searching, my detector started beeping like crazy near one of the support beams. My heart raced as I started digging, thinking I'd hit the jackpot. Instead, I pulled out this old glass jar caked in dirt. I wiped it off and nearly dropped it when I saw what was inside, a human hand. Not just any hand, but a shriveled, mummified one. The skin was dark and leathery, pulled tight over the bones. The fingers were curled inward, like it was grasping at something. I scrambled out from under the house so fast I smacked my head on a beam. Richard and Pamela were waiting outside, all excited. Their faces fell when they saw my pale, sweaty face and the jar clutched in my shaking hands. "Oh my God," Pamela gasped. "Is that—" I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "We need to call the police." But Richard grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said urgently. "Before we do anything, I think we should talk to Charles next door. He's lived here forever and might know something about this." I was skeptical, but agreed. We headed over to Charles's place, a small bungalow next to Richard and Pamela's Victorian. Charles was this older guy, probably in his 70s, with wild white hair and thick glasses. When we showed him the jar, his eyes went wide. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. So the stories were true after all. We all leaned in as Charles launched into this crazy tale. According to him, back during the Great Depression, there was this guy named Marv who lived in Richard and Pamela's house. Marv was a taxidermist who'd inherited a bunch of gold coins from his father. But times were tough, and Marv got paranoid about thieves. One night, Marv apparently went nuts and decided to bury the coins under the house. But he was so worked up that he accidentally sliced off his own hand with the shovel. Instead of going to the hospital, the crazy bastard preserved his own hand and buried it with the coins as some kind of sick guardian. It was a wild story, but it seemed to fit. We were all pretty shaken up. I suggested again that we call the police, but Charles talked us out of it. He said it would just cause a bunch of legal headaches, and we should try to find out more first. That's when things started getting weird. Charles mentioned offhand that Marv had a daughter named Stacy who still lived in town. He gave us her address, saying maybe she'd know more details. I volunteered to go talk to Stacy, while Richard and Pamela stayed behind with Charles. Looking back, I should have been more suspicious about how eager Charles was to send me off alone, but I was caught up in the mystery of it all. I found Stacy's place easily enough, a little apartment above the local diner. She answered the door looking confused. She was probably in her 60s, with graying hair and kind eyes. When I explained why I was there, her face went pale. "I'm sorry," she said shakily, "but I think you've been lied to. My father's name wasn't Marv, it was Harold. And he wasn't a taxidermist, he was a banker. We never lived in that old Victorian house." My stomach dropped. I showed her a picture of the hand on my phone. She gasped and stumbled back. "Oh my God," she whispered. That's Charles's hand." My head was spinning as Stacy told me the real story. Turns out, Charles used to be a small-time criminal back in the day. He'd stolen a bunch of gold coins from the bank where Stacy's dad worked, but during his getaway, he'd gotten his hand mangled in some machinery. A doctor friend had to amputate the hand, but Charles was paranoid about leaving evidence. So he'd preserved the hand and hidden it, along with the coins. He'd been living next door to his stash for decades, waiting for a chance to retrieve it. I felt sick. I'd left Richard and Pamela alone with this guy. I tried calling them but got no answer. Stacy insisted on coming with me as we raced back to the house. When we pulled up, Charles's car was gone. We burst into Richard and Pamela's place to find them tied up in the living room. They were okay, just shaken. Charles had taken the jar and fled. We called the police, but they never found Charles. The case is still open. Sometimes I lie awake at night, wondering where he is, if he ever found those coins. But mostly, I think about that hand. Was it really his? Why keep it all those years? I still work as a handyman sometimes, but I'm a lot more careful about the jobs I take now. And I always keep an eye out for old jars buried in dark places. You never know what secrets might be hidden just beneath the surface. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It was a chilly January morning in 2023, and we had just moved into our new house a few weeks ago. My family and I were still getting used to the neighborhood, trying to settle into our new routines. I'm 15, and my little sister V is 10. We were both excited about the move, especially because our parents had promised we could finally get a dog. That's how Harley came into our lives. He was this adorable golden retriever puppy, all floppy ears and wagging tail. V and I fell in love with him instantly. We'd take turns walking him every day after school, and that particular day, it was my turn. I remember putting on my coat and calling out to V, "Hey, want to come walk Harley with me?" She jumped at the chance, as usual. We clipped on Harley's leash and headed out into the crisp afternoon air. Everything seemed normal at first. We walked down our street, Harley trotting happily ahead of us, his tail swishing back and forth. V was chattering away about something that happened at school. and I was only half listening, my mind wandering to the homework I had waiting for me back home. We turned the corner onto the next street, and that's when things started to feel off. I can't explain it, but suddenly the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. The street seemed emptier than usual, no cars passing by, no other people out walking. Even the birds had gone quiet. V must have sensed it too, because she stopped mid-sentence and grabbed my arm. "What's wrong?" I asked her, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. She pointed ahead. "Look at Harley," she whispered. I followed her gaze, and my blood ran cold. Harley had stopped walking and was standing stock still about 20 feet ahead of us. His back was to us, but something about his posture was all wrong. He looked taller somehow, his fur standing on end. "Harley," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Come here, boy." Slowly, so slowly it made my skin crawl, Harley turned around. Except it wasn't Harley. Not really. It looked like him. Every detail was perfect. The golden fur, the floppy ears, even the little white patch on his chest. But the eyes, oh God, the eyes. They were glowing a brilliant, unnatural gold, nothing like Harley's warm brown eyes. V let out a small whimper beside me, and I instinctively pulled her closer. "That's not Harley," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could respond, the thing that looked like Harley opened its mouth. I expected a bark, but what came out was a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It was like a scream and a howl mixed together, high-pitched and guttural at the same time. It echoed down the empty street, making my ears ring. That's when we ran. I grabbed V's hand, and we took off back the way we came, our feet pounding against the pavement. I could hear it behind us, that terrible not Harley thing, its claws clicking on the sidewalk as it gave chase. We rounded the corner onto our street, gasping for air. "Mom! Dad!" I screamed as we approached our house. "Help!" Our front door flew open, and our parents rushed out, looking confused and scared. "What's wrong?" Mom called out. "Inside! Get inside!" I yelled, pushing V ahead of me up the front steps. We all tumbled into the house, and Dad slammed the door shut behind us. "What happened?" he demanded, looking from me to V and back again. Between gasps for air, we tried to explain. About Harley, about the eyes, about the scream. Our parents looked at us like we were crazy. "But Harley's right here," Mom said, pointing to the living room. We all turned to look, and there was Harley, curled up on his bed, looking up at us with his normal brown eyes. He wagged his tail when he saw us, looking as innocent and friendly as ever. I felt my knees go weak. That's impossible," I stammered. He was just out there." Dad went to the window and peered out. "There's nothing out there," he said, his voice stern but with an undercurrent of concern. "Are you two playing some kind of prank?" "No!" V cried, tears streaming down her face. "It was real. It looked just like Harley, but it wasn't him." Mom knelt down next to V, wrapping her in a hug. "Sweetie, you must have imagined it. Maybe you saw a stray dog that looked like Harley and got scared. But I knew what we saw. It wasn't our imagination, and it wasn't a stray dog. It was something else." The rest of that day passed in a blur. Our parents called the police, probably more to humor us than anything else. The officers who came looked around outside but found nothing unusual. They suggested maybe we'd seen a coyote or a large fox, something that could explain our fear without resorting to supernatural explanations. But I knew the truth. What we saw wasn't natural. It wasn't just a wild animal that happened to look like our dog. It was something that had deliberately taken Harley's form, something that could mimic him perfectly except for those terrifying golden eyes. That night, None of us slept well. Every sound made me jump, convinced that the thing was back, trying to get into our house. I kept checking on Harley, half expecting to find him gone and the mimic in his place. The next few days were tense. V and I refused to walk Harley, and honestly, our parents seemed reluctant to let us out of their sight. We stayed inside as much as possible, jumping at every noise, peering nervously out of windows. About a week after the incident, I woke up in the middle of the night to a familiar sound, that same unearthly scream howl we'd heard that day. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. From down the hall, I heard V start to cry. I ran to my window and looked out into the darkness of our backyard. There, standing just at the edge of the light from our porch, was a dog-shaped silhouette. As I watched, frozen in terror, it turned its head and looked right at me. Those golden eyes glowed in the darkness, seeming to stare straight into my soul. I screamed then, louder than I've ever screamed in my life. My parents came running, and by the time we all looked out the window again, the thing was gone. That was the last straw for our family. We moved out the very next day, leaving most of our things behind in our haste to get away. We went to stay with our grandparents in another state, taking Harley with us. It's been months now, and we still haven't gone back to that house. Our parents tried to explain it away, mass hysteria, tricks of the light, overactive imaginations. But V and I know what we saw. We know it was real. I still have nightmares about those glowing golden eyes, about that creature that could look so much like our beloved pet, but be something so utterly wrong. I don't know what it was or why it targeted us. Was it just playing some twisted game, or did it have some darker purpose? I don't have any answers, only questions that keep me up at night. All I know is that somewhere out there, there's a thing that can look like anything or anyone it wants, and that thought terrifies me more than anything else in this world. So if you're out walking your dog one day and something feels off, if the air gets heavy and the world goes quiet, if your pet starts acting strange, run. Run as fast as you can, because it might not be your pet anymore. It might be something else entirely, something with glowing golden eyes and a scream that will haunt your nightmares forever. Red Hollow was this dense forest in North Carolina that we'd heard stories about growing up. People said it was haunted, but we laughed it off as local legends. We were young and invincible, or so we thought. We arrived at the forest on a sweltering summer afternoon in 2005. The air was thick and humid, making it hard to breathe as we hiked deeper into the woods. Lucas was leading the way, map in hand, while Michelle and I followed, swatting mosquitoes and complaining about the heat. As the sun began to set, we realized we'd wandered off the main trail. Lucas insisted he knew where we were, but I could see the worry in Michelle's eyes. That's when we stumbled upon the cabin. It was old and decrepit, barely standing among the overgrown foliage. The windows were boarded up, and the wood was rotting. Something about it made my skin crawl, but we were tired and needed shelter for the night. "Guys, I don't think we should go in there," Michelle said, her voice trembling slightly. Lucas scoffed. "Come on, it's just an old cabin. Better than sleeping outside with the bears, right?" I hesitated, but ultimately agreed with Lucas. We cautiously approached the cabin, the floorboards creaking under our weight as we stepped onto the porch. The door was slightly ajar, and Lucas pushed it open with a loud creak that echoed through the forest. The inside of the cabin was a mess. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. There was an old fireplace, a rickety table, and a few broken chairs. We decided to set up our sleeping bags in the main room, not wanting to explore the cabin further in the dark. As night fell, an eerie silence descended upon the forest. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just an oppressive quiet that made it hard to sleep. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around midnight, I heard it, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before, a mix between a high-pitched screech and a guttural growl. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered. Lucas and Michelle were both awake, their eyes wide with fear. We huddled together, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. "We need to get out of here," Michelle said, her voice barely audible. We quickly packed our things, hands shaking as we stuffed our sleeping bags into our backpacks. Just as we were about to leave, something slammed against the cabin wall, making the whole structure shake. Lucas peered out of a crack in the boarded-up window and let out a strangled gasp. "Oh my God," he breathed. I couldn't help myself. I had to look. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs were long and spindly, like tree branches stretching towards the sky. Its body was emaciated, skin pulled tight over protruding bones. But its face, God, its face. It looked like the skull of a starved deer, with empty eye sockets that somehow glowed in the darkness. The creature's jaw hung open, revealing rows of sharp yellowed teeth. We all saw it. We all froze in terror. Then it let out another bone-chilling screech, and we snapped into action. Lucas threw open the cabin door, and we ran. We ran like we'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear it behind us, moving impossibly fast for something so large. Michelle was right behind me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Lucas was a few feet ahead, leading the way. We had no idea where we were going. We just knew we had to get away. Suddenly, Michelle screamed. I turned to see her trip over a root, falling hard onto the forest floor. I stopped to help her up, but she yelled at me to keep running. "Go! It's right behind us!" she cried. I hesitated for a split second, torn between helping my friend and saving myself. In that moment, I saw the creature emerge from the shadows behind her. Its long, bony fingers reached out, almost touching her. I'm ashamed to say I ran. I ran and didn't look back, Michelle's screams echoing in my ears. Lucas and I kept going, our lungs burning, our legs aching. We ran until we couldn't anymore, collapsing on the forest floor, gasping for air. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what happened hit us. Michelle was gone. We'd left her behind. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, jumping at every sound, praying for daylight. When the sun finally rose, we found our way back to the main trail and eventually to our car. We drove straight to the police station, our story tumbling out in a frantic, jumbled mess. They searched for Michelle for weeks. They combed through Red Hollow Forest, but they never found her. They never found the cabin either. It was like it had vanished into thin air. Lucas and I were questioned extensively. They thought we might have done something to Michelle, but eventually they had to let us go. There was no evidence of foul play, just the ramblings of two terrified teenagers about a monster in the woods. It's been almost 2 decades, and I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing Michelle's screams. Lucas and I don't talk anymore. Too many painful memories. I've tried to convince myself that what we saw that night was just a hallucination, maybe from some toxic fumes in that old cabin. But deep down, I know what I saw. I don't know what that thing in Red Hollow Forest was. I don't know what happened to Michelle. All I know is that something evil lives in those woods, something that defies explanation. And it's still out there, waiting for its next victims. I'm sharing this story now as a warning. Stay away from Red Hollow Forest. Don't dismiss the local legends. And if you ever find yourself face to face with something you can't explain, run, run, and don't look back. Because sometimes the monsters in the dark are real, and they're hungry. It was just supposed to be a normal Friday night. My mom had a late shift at the hospital, so I was home alone with our dog Stella. I didn't mind. At 15, I was used to having the house to myself sometimes. I ordered a pizza, sprawled out on the couch to binge-watch my favorite show, and tried to ignore the storm raging outside. Around 10 p.m., I heard the front door open and close. "Serena? I'm home early," my mom called out. I was surprised. She wasn't due back for hours, but I figured maybe her shift got cut short because of the weather. "In here, Mom," I yelled back from the living room. I heard her footsteps coming down the hall, but something felt off. The cadence was wrong somehow, too slow and deliberate. And Stella, who usually ran to greet my mom, was sitting rigid next to me, hackles raised. A chill ran down my spine as the footsteps got closer. "Mom?" I called out again, my voice shaking slightly. No response, just those slow, heavy footsteps. I muted the TV, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped right outside the living room, but no one came in. The silence stretched on, broken only by Stella's low growl. "Mom, you're freaking me out," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "What are you doing?" "Oh, just checking on you, sweetie," came my mom's voice from the hallway. But it wasn't quite right. The pitch was a little too low, the tone a little too flat. My heart was racing now. I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was out there, it wasn't my mother. "Who are you?" I demanded, proud that my voice only shook a little. "What do you want?" A laugh that was almost, but not quite, my mom's laugh. "Don't be silly, honey. It's just me. Why don't you come give your mother a hug?" I was frozen in terror, unable to move or speak. Stella leapt off the couch, barking furiously at the hallway, and then it stepped into view. It looked like my mom, but wrong. Too tall, limbs too long and slightly bent at unnatural angles. Its face was like a mask that didn't quite fit, features slightly misaligned. And its eyes, God, its eyes, black and empty and so hungry. I screamed. I couldn't help it. The thing's mouth stretched into a grotesque parody of my mom's smile, far too wide with too many teeth. "What's wrong, sweetie?" it asked in that awful, not quite right voice. "Don't you want to hug your mommy?" It took a halting step towards me. I scrambled backwards, falling off the couch. Stella was going berserk, lunging at the thing but seeming afraid to actually touch it. My back hit the wall, and I realized I was trapped. The creature kept coming, jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. "Stay back," I yelled, my voice cracking. "You're not my mom. What are you?" It cocked its head at an impossible angle, neck bent almost 90 degrees. "Of course I am, silly girl. Who else would I be?" Another step closer. "Now be a good daughter and give Mommy a kiss." I was sobbing now, pressed against the wall. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying I'd wake up. A cold, clammy hand touched my cheek. My eyes flew open to see its face inches from mine, mouth stretched in that terrible grin. "There's my good girl," it purred. I don't know where I found the strength, but somehow I shoved past it and ran. I could hear it laughing behind me as I raced up the stairs, Stella at my heels. I slammed into my bedroom and locked the door, then wedged my desk chair under the knob for good measure. "Serena," its voice called from right outside. "Why are you hiding from Mommy? Don't you love me anymore?" I was shaking uncontrollably, trying desperately to think of what to do. My phone was still downstairs. Even if I could call for help, who would believe me? "I know you're in there, sweetie," it crooned. "You can't hide from me. I'll always find you." I heard a scraping sound, like nails or claws dragging down the door. Stella whimpered and burrowed under the bed. "Go away," I screamed. "You're not real. Leave me alone." More laughter, harsh and grating now. "Oh, I'm very real, little girl, and I'm not going anywhere." The doorknob started to rattle. I watched in horror as it slowly began to turn, despite being locked. The chair under the knob started to scrape across the floor as some unseen force pushed against the door. I was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. As the door inched open, I curled into a ball in the corner, squeezing my eyes shut and praying for it all to be over. And then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, my mom's key in the front door lock. Her real voice called out, "Serena, why are all the lights off?" The presence outside my door vanished instantly. I sagged with relief, tears streaming down my face. "Mom," I sobbed. "Mom, help!" I heard her running up the stairs. "Serena, what's wrong? Are you okay?" I flung open the door and threw myself into her arms, shaking and crying too hard to speak. She held me tight, stroking my hair. "Shh, it's okay. I'm here. What happened, baby?" Through my sobs, I managed to choke out, "There was something here. It looked like you, but it wasn't. It was trying to get me." My mom froze. "What do you mean it looked like me?" I told her everything, the words pouring out in a frantic jumble. To her credit, she listened without interrupting, her face growing paler by the second. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "We need to leave. Now." We threw some clothes in a bag and ran out to the car, Stella in tow. As we pulled out of the driveway, I could have sworn I saw a figure in the upstairs window, watching us go. But when I blinked, it was gone. Mom drove us to her friend Carol's house a few towns over. She called the police from there and reported a break-in, not mentioning anything supernatural. I was secretly relieved. I didn't want anyone thinking I was crazy. 2 officers came to take our statement. They were sympathetic, but skeptical, clearly thinking this was just a scared teenager's overactive imagination, until they went to check out our house. They came back an hour later, visibly shaken. The younger cop, Officer Jenkins, could barely speak. His partner, Officer Rodriguez, told us what they'd found. The house was in chaos, furniture overturned, claw marks on the walls. But that wasn't the worst part. They'd split up to search the rooms, and each one had seen something. For Officer Jenkins, it was his dead father, asking why he'd let him die alone in the hospital. For Officer Rodriguez, it was his ex-wife, begging him to come back to her. Both apparitions vanished as soon as the other cop came into the room. "I don't know what the hell is in your house," Officer Rodriguez said, "but it ain't human. We're gonna need backup on this one." They called in reinforcements, more cops, a SWAT team, even some paranormal investigators. But every time someone went into the house, they came out white-faced and trembling, having seen their worst fears brought to life. Eventually, they declared the house unsafe and cordoned it off. We were told to stay away until further notice. Mom and I have been staying with Carol ever since, too scared to go back. The weirdest part? A week after it all happened, we drove by the house. It looked totally normal. No police tape, no sign of damage. When Mom called to ask what was going on, the police had no record of ever being called out there. The 2 officers who'd taken our statement didn't even work for the department anymore. They'd both quit suddenly, moving away without telling anyone where they were going. It's like that night never happened. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I see the haunted look in my mom's eyes, or notice how Stella still won't go near that house, and I know it was real. I don't know what that thing was, or why it chose our home. I don't know if it's still there, waiting. All I know is that I'm never setting foot in that house again, and I'll never forget the terror of that night when something wearing my mother's face tried to take me. That is, until the dream started. It began with a vague sense of unease, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. But as the weeks went by, the feeling grew stronger. I'd wake up in cold sweats, heart pounding, absolutely certain that I was going to die before my next birthday. The dreams were always the same. I'd see myself standing on the beach, waves lapping at my feet, when suddenly the water would rise up and swallow me whole. I'd try to scream, but no sound would come out. At first, I tried to shrug it off, but the dreams kept coming, night after night, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I finally worked up the courage to tell my mother, Josephine, over breakfast one morning. "Ma," I said, my voice shaking, I think I'm going to die before I turn 17. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Peggy Marie O'Connor, don't you dare say such foolish things. You'll give yourself a fright for no good reason." But I couldn't shake the feeling. It followed me everywhere, to school, to church, even when I was out with my sisters. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, waiting for death to come for me at any moment. My sisters tried to cheer me up, but I could see the worry in their eyes. Catherine, who was closest to me in age, would sit with me at night when the dreams got really bad. She'd hold my hand and tell me stories until I fell asleep. As the weeks went by and my birthday drew closer, the dread only grew stronger. I started avoiding the beach altogether, terrified that my dreams would come true. My mother, exasperated by my behavior, finally took me to see Father O'Malley at the local church. "Now, Peggy," he said gently, "the Lord works in mysterious ways, but He doesn't give us knowledge of our own deaths. That's not for us to know." I wanted to believe him, I really did, but the certainty of my impending doom had taken root deep in my soul. I'd lie awake at night, listening to the distant sound of waves crashing on the shore, wondering if each breath would be my last. It was about a month before my 17th birthday when things took an unexpected turn. Catherine burst into our room one afternoon, practically bouncing with excitement. "Peggy, there's a dance over in Millbrook next weekend. We simply must go." I hesitated, torn between my fear and the desire to spend time with my sister. In the end, Catherine's enthusiasm won out. I agreed to go, figuring that if I was going to die soon anyway, I might as well enjoy myself a little first. The night of the dance arrived, and I found myself actually looking forward to it. Catherine had helped me pick out a dress, and for a few hours I almost felt like a normal teenage girl again. We were running late, as usual. Catherine was behind the wheel of our father's old Ford, speeding down the coastal road. I remember laughing at something she said, the wind whipping through my hair. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. I'm not sure exactly what happened. One moment we were driving along, and the next, the car was spinning out of control. I heard the screech of tires, the crunch of metal, and Catherine's terrified scream. When I came to, the world was upside down. It took me a moment to realize the car had flipped. My head was pounding, and I could taste blood in my mouth, but I was alive. "Catherine," I called out, my voice barely a whisper. "Catherine, are you okay?" There was no answer. I don't remember much of what happened next. Somehow, I managed to crawl out of the wreckage. I stumbled to Catherine's side of the car, calling her name over and over. But deep down, I already knew. My sister was gone. The next few days passed in a blur of grief and guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that it should have been me. After all, I was the one who was supposed to die, not Catherine. She had her whole life ahead of her. As my 17th birthday approached, I found myself almost wishing for death. Anything to escape the crushing weight of loss and survivor's guilt. But the day came and went, and I was still here. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. I kept waiting for death to come for me, but it never did. I graduated high school, went to college, got married, had children of my own. All the while, the memory of that summer and my certainty of impending doom never quite left me. Now, as I sit here at the ripe old age of 91, I can't help but marvel at the twists and turns life has taken. I've outlived all my sisters, my parents, even some of my own children. And yet, the memory of that summer in 1934 remains as vivid as ever. I've spent a lifetime trying to make sense of what happened. Was it all just a coincidence? A self-fulfilling prophecy that somehow went awry? Or was there something more at play? Some greater design that I'm still struggling to understand? I don't have any answers, but I do know this. Life is precious and unpredictable. We never truly know what's around the corner. All we can do is cherish each moment we're given and hold our loved ones close. As for me, I still avoid the beach when I can. The sound of waves still sends a chill down my spine. But I've made my peace with the fact that some mysteries in life will never be solved. And maybe that's okay. I just hope that wherever Catherine is now, she knows how much I've missed her all these years, and that not a day goes by that I don't think of her and wonder, why her and not me? The cabin was pretty remote, nestled deep in the forest about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. As we pulled up the dirt road, I felt a wave of nostalgia wash over me. The old wooden structure looked exactly as I remembered it, maybe a bit more weathered, but still standing strong. My younger brother, Jake, was practically bouncing with excitement as we unloaded the car. He'd always loved exploring the woods around the cabin. The first couple of days were great. We hiked, fished in the nearby stream, and spent our evenings around the campfire telling stories. It was like stepping back in time, and I found myself really enjoying the break from the constant buzz of technology and city life. But on the third night, everything changed. It was getting dark, and we were all sitting around the fire pit in front of the cabin. My dad and Grandpa were discussing some old family stories, and Jake was roasting marshmallows. I remember feeling so content at that moment, surrounded by my family and the peaceful sounds of the forest. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. We all fell silent, straining our ears to catch it again. For a few moments, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire. Then Jake pointed towards the tree line and whispered, "Did you see that?" I followed his gaze, but I couldn't make out anything in the darkness beyond the firelight. My dad stood up, grabbing the flashlight we kept nearby. "Probably just a deer," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He swept the beam of light across the edge of the forest, and that's when I saw it. For a split second, something moved between the trees. It was tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen, easily over 6.5 feet. But it wasn't the height that made my blood run cold. It was the way it moved. It was unnaturally fluid, almost like it was gliding rather than walking. My grandpa must have seen it too, because he suddenly stood up, his face pale in the firelight. "Everyone inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled into the cabin, my dad slamming and locking the door behind us. Jake was shaking, and I put my arm around him, trying to calm him down, even though my own heart was racing. "What was that, Grandpa?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Our grandfather hesitated, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. "I've heard stories," he finally said, "but I never believed them until now." He went on to tell us about local legends of skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures that could take on the form of animals or humans. I'd always thought they were just scary stories to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods, but the fear in my grandpa's eyes told me this was something more. We spent a restless night in the cabin, jumping at every creak and rustle from outside. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, we decided to pack up and leave. But as we were loading up the car, Jake realized he'd left his favorite hat down by the stream where we'd been fishing the day before. "I'll go get it," he said, already heading towards the path. "No!" my dad and Grandpa shouted almost in unison. But Jake was already at the edge of the clearing, and that's when we saw it again. It stepped out from behind a massive oak tree, and this time I got a clear look at it in the morning light. It was even taller than I'd thought, easily 7 feet. Its body was humanoid but wrong somehow, too thin and elongated. But it was the skin that made me want to scream. It was covered in patches of red and brown, like old blood and mud caked together. Jake froze, and for a moment, everything was eerily still. Then the creature let out that same horrible sound we'd heard the night before, and it started moving towards Jake with impossible speed. "Run!" I screamed, and Jake snapped out of his trance, sprinting back towards us. My grandpa had already run back into the cabin, and he emerged with his old hunting rifle. He fired a shot at the creature, but it didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, its focus entirely on Jake. I've never run so fast in my life as I did to reach my brother. I grabbed his arm and practically dragged him the last few feet to the car. We piled in, my dad gunning the engine before the doors were even fully closed. As we sped down the dirt road, I looked back. The creature was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us go. Even from that distance, I could feel its eyes on me, and I knew with chilling certainty that this wasn't over. We drove straight home without stopping, all of us too shaken to speak. In the days that followed, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a bear or some kind of elaborate prank. But deep down, we all knew the truth. It's been almost a year now, and we haven't been back to the cabin. My grandpa sold it a few months ago, unable to face the memories of that day. Jake still has nightmares, and I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that tall, blood-stained figure lurking in the shadows. I don't know what that thing was, or why it seemed so fixated on my brother. All I know is that there are things out there in the darkness that defy explanation, things that most people are lucky enough to never encounter. But once you've seen them, you can never unsee them, and you'll never feel truly safe in the woods again. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can hear that low, guttural sound again. And I wonder if it's found us, if it's out there watching and waiting. Because the most terrifying thing about that day wasn't just seeing the creature. It was the feeling that somehow, in some way, it knew us. And I can't shake the fear that one day it might come back to finish whatever it started in those woods. The doctors were doing everything they could, but my condition kept deteriorating. I remember drifting in and out of consciousness, feeling like I was drowning in my own lungs. The pain was excruciating, and I could barely breathe. At one point, I genuinely thought I wasn't going to make it. That's when things took a bizarre turn. I had what I can only describe as an out-of-body experience. It felt like I was floating above my hospital bed, looking down at my own body. The room seemed to fade away, and suddenly I found myself surrounded by darkness. At first, I thought this was it. I was dying. But then I noticed something moving in the darkness. It was hard to make out at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was underwater. The darkness wasn't just emptiness. It was the depths of the ocean. I started to panic, feeling like I couldn't breathe. But somehow, I was still conscious and aware. That's when I saw it. A massive, shadowy form moving towards me through the murky water. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It seemed to shift and change shape as it approached, sometimes looking almost human-like, other times more like some kind of monstrous sea creature. As it got closer, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. This thing, whatever it was, radiated malevolence. I tried to swim away, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, forced to watch as this entity drifted closer and closer. When it was right in front of me, I saw what looked like a face form in the darkness. It was grotesque, a twisted mixture of human and animal features that made my skin crawl. Its eyes were pitch black and seemed to bore into my soul. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. That's when I felt it, a strange tugging sensation in my throat. It was as if the creature was reaching inside me and pulling something out. I realized with horror that it was stealing my voice. The pain was indescribable. It felt like my very essence was being ripped away. I tried desperately to hold on, to fight back somehow, but I was powerless against this thing. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, everything changed. The darkness around me seemed to shimmer and break apart. Suddenly, I was surrounded by a warm, golden light. The oppressive feeling of dread lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and safety. In the light, I saw two figures appear. They were hazy and indistinct, but somehow familiar. As they drew closer, I realized why. They were my grandfathers, both of whom had passed away years ago. They didn't speak, but I could feel their presence surrounding me, protecting me from the dark entity. The creature seemed to recoil from the light, shrinking back into the depths. I felt a surge of strength flow through me, pushing back against the thing that was trying to steal my voice. With one final desperate effort, I managed to wrench myself free from its grasp. The underwater scene dissolved around me, and I found myself back in my body, gasping for air in the hospital bed. The doctors later told me it had been a close call. My heart had actually stopped for a few minutes. They called my recovery a miracle. I didn't tell them about what I'd experienced. How could I? They'd think I was crazy. But I knew something had happened to me in those moments between life and death. The memory of that dark entity and the feeling of my voice being stolen haunted me. I couldn't shake the fear that somehow some part of me was still trapped in that watery abyss. For days after I was released from the hospital, I found myself unable to speak above a whisper. The doctors said it was likely due to the intubation, but I knew better. I could feel the emptiness in my throat where my voice used to be. Desperate for answers, I decided to seek out a spiritual healer. I'd never been one for that kind of thing before, but my experience had shaken my beliefs to the core. I needed to understand what had happened to me. The session was intense. As soon as the healer laid her hands on me, I felt a jolt of energy course through my body. She closed her eyes and began to describe what she was seeing, a dark, watery realm and a malevolent presence lurking there. My blood ran cold as I realized she was describing exactly what I had experienced. But then she smiled and told me not to be afraid. She said she could sense two powerful protective presences around me, my grandfathers. According to her, they had intervened during my near-death experience, saving me from the entity that was trying to claim my soul. As she spoke, I felt a warmth spreading through my chest. Memories of my grandfathers flooded back, fishing trips, bedtime stories, the sound of their laughter. I remembered how safe and loved I had always felt around them. The healer told me that the entity had been drawn to me because of my weakened state, but that my grandfather's spirits had been watching over me. She believed they had used their own energy to drive the creature away and pull me back from the brink of death. As the session went on, I felt something shift inside me. It was as if a weight was being lifted off my chest. When it was over, I thanked the healer and left, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. That night, I had a vivid dream. I was back in that underwater realm, but this time I wasn't afraid. I could see my grandfathers standing beside me, their presence strong and reassuring. Together, we faced the darkness. I felt a surge of power flow through me, and I opened my mouth to speak. My voice came out strong and clear, echoing through the water. The dark entity recoiled, shrinking away from the sound. I kept speaking, letting out all the fear and pain I'd been holding on to. With each word, I felt stronger, more whole. When I woke up, my throat felt different. I took a deep breath and spoke. My voice was back, stronger than ever. It was as if the last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. In the weeks since then, I've done a lot of thinking about what happened to me. I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand it, but I've come to believe that there are forces out there beyond our comprehension. Some of them may be dangerous, but others, like the spirits of my grandfathers, are there to protect us. I've also gained a new appreciation for the power of voice, not just the physical act of speaking, but the ability to express ourselves, to connect with others, to make ourselves heard. I realized how much I had taken that for granted before. This experience has changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I find myself reaching out to family members I've lost touch with, sharing stories about our grandparents, strengthening those bonds. I've started keeping a journal, writing down my thoughts and feelings, giving voice to parts of myself I've long ignored. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel a chill run down my spine when I remember that dark entity and how close I came to losing everything. But then I think of my grandfathers, of the love and protection I felt in their presence, and I know I'm not alone. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened to me in those moments between life and death, but I do know that it's given me a new perspective on life, on family, and on the power of our own voices. Whatever that entity was, whatever it wanted from me, it ultimately failed. I'm still here, I'm still speaking, and I'm more determined than ever to make my voice count. So if you're reading this and you've ever felt silenced or powerless, remember, your voice matters. Use it. Share your story. Connect with those around you. You never know who might be listening, or what forces might be out there, ready to help you when you need it most. It all started when I decided to take a day trip to Fort Niagara. I've always been a history buff, so I was excited to tour the 18th century fort and learn about its role in the French and Indian War. The first 2 floors were fascinating, full of artifacts and historical displays. But when I climbed the narrow stairs to the third floor, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The air felt thick and oppressive, like it was hard to breathe. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I broke out in a cold sweat. I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone up there, that some unseen presence was watching me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just letting my imagination run wild. But then I heard it, a faint whisper right behind my ear. I whirled around, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I forced myself to take a few steps, looking around wildly. That's when I saw it out of the corner of my eye, a dark, shadowy figure dart across the far end of the room. I blinked, and it was gone. I'd had enough. I bolted down those stairs faster than I've ever moved in my life. I didn't stop until I was outside in the bright sunlight, gasping for air. The tour guide gave me a strange look and asked if I was all right. I muttered something about feeling claustrophobic and got the hell out of there. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe the stuffy air and dim lighting had played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something otherworldly had been up there with me. I hoped that would be the end of the weirdness. But a few days later, I had another unsettling experience. I was doing some work in the office of the bed and breakfast where I was staying. It was an old Victorian house, full of antique furniture and creaky floorboards. I was alone in the office, typing away on my laptop, when suddenly the temperature dropped dramatically. I could see my breath in the air. The old desk lamp flickered and went out. I reached to turn it back on, but it wouldn't work. That's when I noticed the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to be moving, shifting and swirling in ways that defied logic. I sat there frozen, unable to look away. Then I felt it, an icy touch on the back of my neck. I yelped and jumped up, knocking over my chair. Heart racing, I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just as quickly as it started, it was over. The shadows were normal again, the temperature returned to normal, and the lamp flickered back on. I ran out of that office and didn't go back for the rest of my stay. The innkeeper seemed concerned when I told her what happened, but she brushed it off, saying the wiring was old and sometimes acted up. But the look in her eyes told me she knew more than she was letting on. These encounters stirred up memories of experiences I'd had as a child, what my parents had always dismissed as night terrors. I'd wake up paralyzed, unable to move or scream, with a dark presence looming over me. Sometimes I'd see glowing red eyes or feel icy fingers on my skin. My parents insisted it was just my overactive imagination, but now I wasn't so sure. As my time in Olcott Beach drew to a close, I found myself lying awake at night, jumping at every creak and shadow. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there had to be logical explanations for everything I'd experienced. But deep down, I knew better. On my last night there, I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. The room was pitch black, but I had the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay there, hardly daring to breathe, straining my ears for any sound. That's when I heard it, soft footsteps moving slowly across the room towards my bed. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The footsteps got closer and closer. I could feel a presence right next to me, looming over the bed. Then, a whisper in my ear. "We've been waiting for you." I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight was streaming through the windows, and everything seemed normal. But there were muddy footprints on the floor next to my bed. I packed my bags and got out of there as fast as I could. I've never been back to Olcott Beach, and I don't think I ever will. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all in my head, just a series of coincidences and an overactive imagination. But in the dark of night, when the shadows grow long, I know the truth. Something was there with me in Olcott Beach, something old, something otherworldly. And sometimes in my dreams, I can still hear that whisper, "We've been waiting for you." I don't know what it means or what those entities want from me, but I have a feeling that one day I'll find out. And that terrifies me more than anything. I've tried to research the history of Olcott Beach and Fort Niagara, looking for any clues about paranormal activity or tragic events that might explain what I experienced. But I haven't found much beyond vague stories and local legends. Part of me wants answers, but another part is afraid of what I might uncover. Since that summer, I've had a few other strange encounters, objects moving on their own, unexplained noises in my house, fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures, but nothing as intense or terrifying as what I experienced in Olcott Beach. It's like whatever is out there made contact with me, and now it's just waiting. I've thought about reaching out to paranormal investigators or mediums, but I'm scared that might make things worse. What if trying to understand it or communicate with it somehow gives it more power over me? So I've kept quiet, only sharing my story anonymously online. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going crazy, if maybe there's some rational explanation for everything that happened. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something dark moving in my peripheral vision, or wake up with that familiar feeling of a presence in my room, and I know it wasn't just my imagination. I don't know why these entities seem drawn to me in Olcott Beach, or what they want. All I know is that my experiences there opened a door to something I don't understand, something ancient and powerful. And I'm terrified that one day that door might open again. So I live my life trying to pretend everything is normal. But I'm always looking over my shoulder, always a little on edge. Because I know now that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Things that lurk in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. If you ever find yourself in Olcott Beach, be careful. Pay attention to that prickle on the back of your neck, that feeling of being watched. And whatever you do, don't go to the 3rd floor of Fort Niagara alone. Some things are better left undisturbed. I wish I could give this story a neat, tidy ending. Tell you that I figured it all out, or that it was just a series of misunderstandings and coincidences. But the truth is, I'm still searching for answers, still jumping at shadows and lying awake at night, wondering if tonight will be the night they come for me again. All I can do is share my story and hope that maybe, just maybe, it will help someone else who finds themselves face to face with the unexplainable. Because now I know the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond is thinner than we think. And sometimes things slip through. So if you ever feel that chill down your spine, that certainty that you're not alone when you should be, trust your instincts. Run, hide, pray, do whatever you have to do. Because once they notice you, once they reach out from the darkness, you might never truly be alone again. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but after what happened in our new house, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started about a week after we moved in. My parents had been excited to find such a spacious old house for a good price, even if it needed some fixing up. I was just happy to have a bigger bedroom. That first week we were all busy unpacking and settling in. The house creaked and groaned a bit, but we chalked it up to it being an older building. Looking back, maybe we should have paid more attention to those noises. It was a Tuesday night when things got weird. I was in my room doing homework when I heard my mom call out from downstairs, asking if I had said something. I yelled back that I hadn't. A few minutes later, she came up to my room looking confused. I could have sworn I heard a little girl's voice calling Mommy from the hallway, she said. I thought maybe it was you playing a prank or something. I assured her it wasn't me, and we both laughed it off as her imagination. But the next night, it happened again. This time, my dad heard it too. They both came rushing up the stairs, thinking I was calling for help or something. But I was just sitting on my bed reading, completely fine. My parents exchanged worried looks, and I could tell they were freaked out. They started asking if I had noticed anything strange in the house. I hadn't, but their concern was making me nervous. The third night is when things got really scary. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As I was walking down the hallway, I clearly heard a soft voice whisper, "Mommy," right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. My heart was pounding as I ran back to my room and dove under the covers. The next morning, I told my parents what happened. They looked pale and admitted they had both been hearing the voice more frequently. My mom said she kept feeling like someone was trying to sit next to her on the couch, but when she looked, no one was there. We were all on edge after that. Every little noise made us jump. My dad started researching the history of the house, but couldn't find anything unusual. No tragic deaths or anything that would explain what was happening. Things came to a head that Friday night. We were all sitting in the living room watching TV, trying to act normal. Suddenly, we heard the voice clear as day. "Mommy, I'm scared." It sounded like it was coming from right next to my mom on the couch. She screamed and leapt up. We all did. There was a visible indentation on the couch cushion next to where she had been sitting, like someone small was sitting there. As we watched in horror, the indentation slowly lifted, as if whatever had been sitting there stood up. We ran out of the house right then and there, not even stopping to grab our things. We spent the night in a hotel, all of us too terrified to go back. The next day, my dad and uncle went back to the house to grab some of our stuff. They said nothing seemed out of place, but the whole house had a creepy vibe that made their skin crawl. We never went back to live there. My parents put the house up for sale immediately, disclosing the weird events to potential buyers. It took almost a year to sell, and we had to drop the price significantly. To this day, I get chills thinking about that voice and the indentation on the couch. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was all in our heads, some kind of shared hallucination brought on by the stress of moving. But deep down, I know what we experienced was real. I've done some research since then on paranormal activity, and apparently it's not uncommon for spirits to be drawn to or attached to certain people, especially mothers. The theory is that the energy of a nurturing maternal figure can attract lost souls, particularly child spirits. That's what I think happened in our case. Some kind of child spirit latched onto my mom, seeing her as a potential mother figure. It's sad when you think about it, this lost little soul just wanting comfort and love, but it doesn't make it any less terrifying to experience. I still have nightmares sometimes where I hear that little voice calling out. In my dreams, I see a shadowy childlike figure standing at the end of a long, dark hallway. It reaches out to me, calling Mommy over and over. I always wake up in a cold sweat after those dreams. The experience has definitely made me more open-minded about the supernatural. I'm not saying I fully believe in ghosts now, but I can't dismiss the possibility either. There are just some things in this world that we can't explain. I've talked to my parents about it over the years, and they're still shaken by what happened. My mom especially has a hard time with it. She says she sometimes still feels like something is watching her, even in our new house. She's jumpy around children now and gets nervous when she hears kids playing. We've never experienced anything like that again, thankfully. But it's left its mark on all of us. I'm much more attuned to my surroundings now, always on alert for anything out of the ordinary. Every time I hear an unexplained noise or feel a sudden chill, my mind immediately goes back to those terrifying nights in that house. I've often wondered what happened to the spirit after we left. Did it stay in the house, waiting for the next family to move in? Or did it somehow follow us, explaining my mom's continued unease? Part of me hopes it found peace somehow, but another part hopes it just ceased to exist. The thought of that lost, scared child spirit still wandering around is just too heartbreaking and frightening to contemplate. I know this all sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story before it happened to us, I probably wouldn't have believed them, but I swear on everything I hold dear that it's true. Every word of it. Sometimes I drive by our old house, just out of curiosity. It looks normal from the outside, a typical suburban home. But knowing what happened inside those walls makes my blood run cold. I always wonder if the new owners have experienced anything strange. Part of me wants to warn them, but I know how insane it would sound. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that there's more to our world than what we can see and explain. Whether you want to call it ghosts, spirits, or something else entirely, there are forces out there beyond our understanding, and sometimes they find their way into our lives in the most unexpected and terrifying ways. I hope I never experience anything like that again, but I know I'll always be looking over my shoulder, listening for that soft, childlike voice calling out in the night. Some things, once experienced, change you forever, and the memory of that voice and that indentation on the couch will haunt me for the rest of my life. I live on a small farm just outside of Boone, North Carolina. It's a beautiful area, nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. My family has owned this land for generations, and I've always felt a deep connection to it. We raise chickens, goats, and a few cows. Nothing too fancy, but it's an honest living. That summer was particularly hot and humid, the kind of weather where the air feels thick and heavy, and you can't escape the heat no matter what you do. I remember waking up early that morning, drenched in sweat despite the fan blowing full blast next to my bed. As I got dressed and headed out to start my chores, I had this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something felt off. I tried to shake it off as I went about feeding the animals and checking the fences. Everything seemed normal at first. The chickens were clucking away, the goats were chomping on grass, and the cows were lazing about in the shade. But as the morning wore on, I started to notice the animals getting agitated. It began with the chickens. They're usually pretty calm, but suddenly they were flapping around and squawking like crazy. I figured maybe a fox or coyote was lurking nearby, so I did a quick perimeter check. Nothing seemed out of place, but the chickens wouldn't settle down. Then the goats started acting up. They huddled together in a tight group, bleating nervously and stamping their hooves. Even the cows, who are normally so docile, were pacing back and forth and snorting. I'd never seen all the animals so worked up at once. I stood in the middle of the barnyard, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. That's when I felt it. This intense sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine despite the sweltering heat. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the tree line at the edge of our property. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then movement caught my eye. There was something there, partially hidden behind a large oak tree. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. As my eyes focused, I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was a figure, but not like any person or animal I'd ever seen before. It was tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was a sickly pale color that seemed to shimmer slightly in the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. But the face, oh God, the face. It didn't really have one, at least not in any normal sense. Where features should have been, there was just smooth, blank skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Yet somehow, I knew it was looking right at me. I stood there frozen, unable to move or even breathe. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been seconds or hours. All I know is that eventually I blinked, and when my eyes opened again, it was gone. I ran back to the house as fast as I could, slamming and locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial my phone to call my wife, who was in town running errands. When she answered, I babbled incoherently about what I'd seen. She tried to calm me down, saying I must have been dehydrated or suffering from heat exhaustion. She said she'd be home soon. I paced around the house, peeking out the windows every few minutes. The animals were still agitated, but I couldn't bring myself to go back outside. When my wife got home about an hour later, she found me sitting at the kitchen table, clutching a glass of water with trembling hands. She convinced me to lie down and rest while she went to check on the animals. I wanted to stop her, to tell her it wasn't safe, but I was so drained I could barely keep my eyes open. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by my wife's scream. I bolted outside, my heart pounding. My wife was standing by the goat pen, her face pale with shock. As I got closer, I saw what had caused her reaction. There, in the middle of the pen, was the severed head of one of our goats. Just the head. The rest of the body was nowhere to be seen. The head was placed deliberately, facing the house. Its eyes were wide open, filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the head had been cleanly removed and carefully placed there as some kind of sick message. We called the police, of course. They came out and took pictures, asked questions. But in the end, they chalked it up to a particularly bold coyote, or maybe even a mountain lion, though those are rare in our area. They clearly didn't believe me when I tried to describe the creature I'd seen earlier. My wife was shaken but practical. She insisted on installing security cameras and motion sensor lights around the property. We got a couple of big guard dogs, too. For weeks after, I barely slept, jumping at every little sound and constantly checking the cameras. But nothing else happened. No more sightings, no more animal deaths. Life gradually returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after something like that. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of farm life and the brutal summer heat had caused some kind of hallucination. But then I remember the goat's head and the look in its eyes, and I know, deep in my bones, that what I saw that day was real. I've done some research since then, read about folklore and legends from this area. Some people call it a wendigo, others have different names for it. But whatever it was here, on my farm. I still work the land, still care for my animals. But I'm always watching the tree line now, always listening for any sign that it might return. Because deep down, I know it's still out there somewhere. And I can't shake the feeling that one day it might come back. It was just another exhausting day at work. As a single mom, I'm used to feeling drained, but that night was different. My body ached, and all I wanted was to get home to my tiny apartment and curl up with my 6-month-old daughter, Emma. I dragged myself to the subway station, cradling Emma against my chest. The platform was deserted, not surprising for that time of night. As the train pulled up, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something felt off, but I brushed it aside, chalking it up to fatigue. We boarded the empty car, and I settled into a seat near the door, rocking Emma gently. The fluorescent lights flickered as we lurched into the tunnel. I closed my eyes, trying to will away my headache. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. My eyes flew open, heart racing. Before I could react, they snapped back on, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the car stood a figure, tall, impossibly tall. Its head nearly brushed the ceiling, but it was wrong, distorted, like someone had stretched a person beyond human limits. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating from exhaustion. When I looked again, it was gone. I let out a shaky laugh, telling myself I needed more sleep. The train screeched to a halt at the next station. No one got on or off. As we started moving again, the lights flickered once more. In that split second of darkness, I felt a presence next to me. When the car illuminated, I nearly screamed. It was there, right beside me. So close I could have reached out and touched it. But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Its face, if you could call it that, was a blur of shadows. No discernible features. Just an inky void where eyes and mouth should be. Emma started fussing, and I clutched her tighter to my chest. I wanted to run, to pull the emergency brake, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen in terror. The thing tilted its head as if studying us. A low hum filled the air, making my teeth ache, and then, in another blink of darkness, it vanished. I gasped for air, trembling uncontrollably. This couldn't be real. I was losing my mind. That had to be it. The rest of the ride was a blur of paranoia. Every shadow, every reflection in the windows, I was convinced it would reappear, but it didn't. When we finally reached my stop, I bolted from the train, not daring to look back. I ran the whole way home, ignoring the strange looks from the few people still out. Once inside, I locked every door and window, then huddled in bed with Emma, leaving all the lights on. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that featureless face, heard that bone-chilling hum. I spent the night jumping at every little sound, convinced it had somehow followed us home. Morning came, and I called in sick to work. I couldn't bear the thought of getting back on that train. As the day wore on, I started to doubt myself. Maybe it had just been a vivid hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew. What I saw was real, and it was still out there. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that life went back to normal. But how do you move on from something like that? For weeks, I was a nervous wreck. I'd wake up in cold sweats, certain I'd seen a towering shadow in the corner of my room. Every unexplained noise sent me into a panic. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried talking to a few friends about it, but they just looked at me with concern and suggested I see a therapist. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown. But therapy couldn't erase what I'd seen. I ended up quitting my job. I couldn't face that subway again. Couldn't risk another encounter. We moved in with my sister in the suburbs, where I found work I could do from home. It's been months now, and I still haven't fully recovered. I avoid public transportation at all costs. Crowded spaces make me anxious, and I'm always watching the shadows. Sometimes I wonder if it was drawn to Emma somehow, if it wanted her. The thought keeps me up at night, checking and rechecking that she's safe in her crib. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to find a rational explanation, but there isn't one. What I encountered that night was something beyond our understanding, something that shouldn't exist in our world. I'm sharing this now as a warning to anyone who rides those late-night trains, who thinks they're alone in an empty car. You're not. There are things out there in the darkness, things that defy explanation, and once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. They change you, haunt you, make you question everything you thought you knew about reality. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again, if I'll ever shake the feeling that it's out there, waiting. All I can do is hold my daughter close and pray that whatever it was, whatever it wanted, it's found someone else to torment. But every time the lights flicker, every time I catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, I'm right back in that subway car, paralyzed with fear, facing something that shouldn't exist. So please, be careful out there. Watch the shadows. And if you ever feel that chill run down your spine, that certainty that you're not alone when you should be, run. Don't look back. Don't try to rationalize it. Just get somewhere safe and hold your loved ones close. Because once you've seen it, you can never go back to the person you were before, and you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when it might appear again. I hope sharing this brings me some peace, that putting it out into the world will somehow lessen its power over me. But even as I type these words, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness just beyond my screen, something is watching, waiting, and I don't know if I'll ever truly feel safe again. It all started on what seemed like a normal Tuesday shift. I'd been working the late-night maintenance crew for about 6 months at that point, mostly doing routine checks and minor repairs in the tunnels after hours. That night, I was assigned to inspect a section of tunnel between 2 stations that had been reporting some electrical issues. As I made my way down the dark tunnel with my flashlight, I noticed some new graffiti on the concrete walls. Nothing too unusual there. Taggers were always finding ways to sneak in and leave their mark. But something about this piece caught my eye. The colors seemed unusually vivid and almost wet-looking, even though the paint should have been dry by then. I moved closer to examine it, and that's when I saw it move. Just a slight ripple at first, like a heat mirage. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things in the dim light. But when I looked again, part of the graffiti was definitely shifting and undulating on the wall. My heart started racing as I watched a section of bright blue detach itself from the wall and stretch out into a long, oozing tendril. It reminded me of those novelty sticky hands kids play with, but alive and pulsing. The tendril reached out towards a rat that had been scurrying along the edge of the tunnel. Before I could react, it snagged the rat and yanked it back into the mass of graffiti on the wall. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam shaking as I tried to process what I'd just witnessed. The graffiti seemed to writhe and churn for a moment before settling back into a still image. The rat was gone without a trace. I got out of there as fast as I could, practically running back to the maintenance office. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely fill out the nightly report. I left most of it blank, only noting that I'd seen some unusual activity in that section of tunnel. I was afraid if I wrote down what I'd actually seen, they'd think I was crazy or on drugs. The next few days I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the dark, cramped environment of the tunnels. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong down there. I started noticing little things, tools going missing from work sites, strange marks on the walls that didn't look like normal wear and tear, and an increase in rats and other small animals in certain areas of the tunnels. About a week after that first incident, I was sent to clear a blockage in one of the drainage pipes. As I was working, I heard a weird squelching sound behind me. I whirled around to see a mass of what looked like graffiti dripping off the wall and oozing across the floor towards me. In a panic, I swung my pipe wrench at it. The wrench sunk into the blob with a sickening squish. The creature, if you could call it that, let out a high-pitched keening noise that made my ears ring. It retreated back to the wall, seeming to melt into the concrete. When I examined the spot afterward, all I could see was a slightly smeared bit of graffiti, but my wrench was pitted and corroded as if it had been dipped in acid. After that, I started paying much closer attention to the graffiti I encountered in the tunnels. Most of it was normal paint, but every so often I'd spot a piece that seemed too vibrant, too fluid. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only for everything to be still when I looked directly at it. I tried reporting my concerns to my supervisor, but he just brushed me off, said I was letting my imagination run wild and that maybe the night shift wasn't a good fit for me. But I knew what I was seeing was real. Things came to a head about a month later. I was doing a solo overnight shift, checking the signals along a particularly long stretch of tunnel. I always hated working alone down there, but budget cuts meant we were understaffed. As I was testing one of the signal boxes, my flashlight started to flicker. I smacked it a few times, but it was dying fast. Just as the beam faded completely, I heard that familiar squelching sound echoing through the tunnel. But this time, it wasn't just from one direction. It was all around me. In the pitch darkness, I could hear the sounds of movement closing in, wet, slithering noises that made my skin crawl. I fumbled for the emergency flashlight on my belt, my hand shaking so bad I could barely grip it. When I finally managed to switch it on, I immediately wished I hadn't. The walls of the tunnel were alive with writhing, colorful masses. What had appeared to be elaborate graffiti murals were peeling away from the concrete, reaching out with tentacle-like appendages. They seemed to recoil slightly from the light, but it wasn't deterring them for long. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not daring to look back. I could hear the squishing, squelching sounds pursuing me, growing louder as the creatures gained on me. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but pure terror kept me going. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw the lights of the station up ahead. I burst out onto the platform, gasping for air, and probably looking like a madman to the handful of late-night commuters waiting for the last train. When I glanced back at the tunnel, everything looked normal. Just regular graffiti on the walls, no sign of the horrors I'd just fled from. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd been seeing for weeks. I quit my job the next day. My supervisor tried to convince me to stay, saying I was one of their best workers. But no amount of money could get me to go back into those tunnels. I filed a full report of everything I'd witnessed, but I doubt anyone took it seriously. They probably wrote me off as another burnout who couldn't hack the pressures of the job. Sometimes I consider going to the media or trying to warn people about what's down there. But who would believe me? I can barely believe it myself most days. All I know is that I'll never look at graffiti the same way again, and I'll certainly never set foot in the subway tunnels after dark. I don't know what those things are or where they came from. Some kind of bizarre underground ecosystem, alien life forms, government experiment gone wrong. I have no answers, only nightmares and a lingering fear every time I pass a colorful mural on the street. If you're reading this and you work in the tunnels, please be careful. Watch the walls. And if you see graffiti that seems to move, run. Run and don't look back, because those tunnels hide secrets that are better left in the dark. It all started about a month ago when I was riding the subway home from work. I usually zone out on my commute, but that day I overheard two guys talking in hushed voices about something called the Chisel Man. At first I thought they were discussing some weird art project, but as I listened more closely, I realized they were talking about an urban legend. According to them, back in the 1950s, there was a serial killer who stalked the subway tunnels, attacking lone passengers with a chisel. He was never caught, and some people believed he still lived down there in abandoned sections of the subway system. The guys were debating whether it was just a myth or if there could be any truth to it. I tried to brush it off as just another creepy story, but something about it stuck with me. That night, I found myself going down an internet rabbit hole, reading old news articles and forum posts about the so-called Chisel Man. The more I read, the more unsettled I felt. There were quite a few reported sightings over the years of a tall, gaunt figure lurking in dark corners of subway platforms. Some even claimed to have barely escaped attacks. I knew it was probably all just urban legend stuff that got exaggerated over time, but a small part of me couldn't help wondering, what if there was some kernel of truth to it? What if some deranged person really had been living in the tunnels all this time? For the next week or so, I found myself on edge during my subway rides. I'd scan the platforms nervously, half expecting to see a shadowy figure watching me. More than once I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only for there to be nothing there when I turned to look. I knew I was just psyching myself out, but I couldn't shake the creeping sense of unease. Then came the night that changed everything. I had to work late and ended up catching one of the last trains home around 1 a.m. The subway car was empty except for me and one other passenger dozing in the corner. As we rattled through the tunnels, I noticed we seemed to be going slower than usual. The lights flickered ominously. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt, lurching me forward in my seat. An automated voice announced there was a delay due to a signal problem. Great, just what I needed at this hour. I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no service down here. After about 10 minutes of sitting in unsettling silence, I decided to step out onto the platform to see if I could figure out what was going on. As soon as the doors opened, I was hit by a blast of musty, stale air. This clearly wasn't a station that saw much use anymore. The platform was dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs, casting long shadows across cracked tiles and graffitied walls. Piles of debris and old equipment were scattered about. It looked like this place hadn't been used in decades. I walked hesitantly down the platform, straining to see in the gloom. My footsteps echoed eerily in the cavernous space. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed a rusted gate at the far end that seemed to lead into an old maintenance tunnel. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from beyond the gate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Was that just the usual creaks and groans of the subway system, or something else? I told myself to turn around and get back on the train, but some morbid curiosity drew me forward. As I got closer to the gate, the scraping got louder. It sounded like metal dragging across concrete. My heart was pounding as I peered through the gate. At first I saw only impenetrable blackness, but then, about 20 feet down the tunnel, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. Slowly, a form began to take shape in the shadows. It was tall and unnaturally thin, standing completely still. I couldn't make out any features, but I had the distinct impression it was facing directly towards me. I stood frozen in terror, unable to look away. Then, with agonizing slowness, the figure began to move. As it took a halting step forward, I heard that scraping sound again. It was dragging something behind it. That was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I stumbled backwards, nearly falling in my haste to get away. I sprinted back to the train, threw myself inside, and frantically pressed the door close button. Just as the doors were sliding shut, I heard rapid footsteps coming down the platform. I caught a fleeting glimpse of a skeletal hand reaching for the doors before they slammed closed. The train lurched forward, leaving the nightmarish figure behind. I collapsed into a seat, shaking uncontrollably. What the hell had I just seen? It couldn't have been real. I must have let my imagination run wild after all those urban legend stories. But it had seemed so vivid, so terrifyingly present. The rest of the ride passed in a blur. When we finally pulled into my stop, I bolted out of the station and didn't slow down until I was safely locked in my apartment. I spent a sleepless night jumping at every little sound, convinced I'd hear that scraping outside my door. In the harsh light of day, I tried to convince myself it had all been a product of sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination. But I couldn't shake the dread that settled in the pit of my stomach. I started taking Ubers to work instead of the subway, making up excuses about track work on my line. A week later, morbid curiosity got the better of me. I had to know if I'd imagined it all. So I worked up the courage to go back to that station late one night. I told myself I'd just take a quick look around the platform and prove to myself there was nothing to be afraid of. But when I got there, my blood ran cold. The gate to the maintenance tunnel was wide open, its heavy padlock shattered on the ground, and scratched crudely into the wall next to it were two words that made my skin crawl. Found you. I ran out of there so fast I nearly fell down the stairs. I haven't set foot in the subway since that night. I keep telling myself it has to be an elaborate prank, someone messing with the urban legend. But late at night, when I hear unexplained noises in my building, I can't help but wonder, what if the Chisel Man is real? What if he's out there, slowly but relentlessly hunting me down? I don't know if I'll ever feel safe on the subway again. Sometimes I think about moving to a new city, starting fresh somewhere far away from here. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispers that it wouldn't matter. He found me once. He'd find me again. So I live in a state of constant unease, always looking over my shoulder. Rationally, I know it's ridiculous to believe in some boogeyman from an old urban legend. But after what I saw that night, I can't quite convince myself it isn't real. And every time I hear an unexplained scraping sound, my heart stops for a moment. I'm not sure why I'm sharing all this. Maybe I just needed to get it off my chest. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has had a similar experience and can tell me I'm not crazy. Or maybe I'm hoping someone can offer a rational explanation for what I saw, something to help me sleep at night. All I know is that I'll never forget that nightmarish figure in the tunnel, and I'll always wonder if someday, somehow, the Chisel Man will find me again. The station was eerily empty as I made my way down to the platform. My footsteps echoed off the grimy tiled walls. I was the only person there, or so I thought. As I walked further onto the platform, I noticed a dark shape hunched over near the edge. At first, I assumed it was just a homeless person sleeping. but as I got closer, I realized with growing horror that it was some kind of massive dog, and it was eating something. My alcohol-addled brain took a few seconds to process what I was seeing. The creature was enormous, easily the size of a full-grown man, with a muscular build that reminded me of a pit bull. But no pit bull I'd ever seen was that big. Its coat was an inky black that seemed to absorb the dim fluorescent lighting. And there, trapped beneath its massive jaws, was unmistakably a human body. I froze in place, unable to move or even breathe. The thing was tearing into the corpse with savage ferocity, ripping off chunks of flesh and swallowing them whole. Blood splattered across the dirty concrete floor. The wet, meaty sounds of its feasting filled the station. Suddenly, as if sensing my presence, the creature's head snapped up and locked eyes with me. Its eyes glowed an unnatural, hellish red. Strings of gore dangled from its jaws as it let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. Pure animal terror jolted through me. I turned and ran faster than I ever had in my life. Behind me, I heard the click of claws on concrete as the monster gave chase. My legs pumped frantically as I sprinted back towards the station entrance. But I knew there was no way I could outrun this thing. In a panic, I veered off and burst through a door marked "Employees Only," praying I could find somewhere to hide. I found myself in a narrow maintenance corridor lined with pipes. The creature's growls were getting closer. I spotted another door at the end of the hall and made a beeline for it. It turned out to be a small, dimly lit bathroom. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the lock. Just as I managed to click it into place, something massive slammed into the other side. The whole door shuddered in its frame. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding out of my chest. The thing outside let out a blood-curdling howl of rage that sounded far too intelligent for any normal animal. It started throwing its weight against the door over and over. Each impact made the hinges groan. I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke through. I pressed myself into the corner furthest from the door, desperately searching for anything I could use as a weapon. But there was nothing, just a grimy sink, toilet, and some paper towels. Tears streamed down my face as I realized this was how I was going to die, torn apart by some kind of demon dog in a filthy subway bathroom. The assault on the door grew more frenzied. I could hear the wood starting to splinter. In desperation, I started screaming at the top of my lungs, praying someone, anyone, would hear me. And then, miraculously, I heard another voice shouting from somewhere down the hall. "Hey, what's going on in there? Help!" I shrieked. "Oh God, please help me." Heavy footsteps approached rapidly. I heard keys jangling, and then suddenly the bathroom door flew open. A burly man in a maintenance uniform burst in, brandishing a large wrench. "What the hell?" he exclaimed, looking around in confusion. I was speechless for a moment, my eyes darting wildly around the small space. The demonic pit bull was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there. The door wasn't even damaged. Are you okay, miss?" the maintenance man asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I heard screaming. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out as an incoherent, hysterical babble. The man clearly thought I was either crazy or on drugs. He gently but firmly escorted me out of the bathroom and back to the main station area, assuring me that there were no giant dogs loose in the subway. My mind was reeling. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I having some kind of psychotic break? But it had felt so real. The sounds, the smells, the bone-deep terror. I couldn't have made it all up. Could I? The maintenance worker called the police. probably more out of concern for my mental state than anything else. When they arrived, I tried once again to explain what I'd seen. They searched the station, but of course found nothing. No giant dog, no mangled corpse on the platform. One of the officers gently suggested that perhaps I'd had too much to drink and experienced some kind of vivid hallucination. I wanted to believe that's all it was. But in the weeks and months that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd encountered was real. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear that inhuman howl echoing in my mind. I've tried researching to see if anyone else has reported similar encounters, but found nothing concrete. All I know is that I'll never feel safe in the subway again. I take cabs or walk everywhere now, no matter how inconvenient, because deep down, I'm terrified that one night I'll be alone on a platform and hear the click of monstrous claws approaching from the shadows. I don't know what that thing was, some escaped exotic pet, a creature from another dimension, or maybe even a literal demon. And I don't know why it appeared to me that night, or why it vanished without a trace. Part of me hopes I never find out, but another part of me is haunted by the need to understand, to make sense of the inexplicable horror I witnessed. So I guess that's why I'm finally sharing this story. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar. Maybe there are others who have encountered impossible, nightmarish things in the darkest corners of the city. Or maybe I really am just losing my mind. I honestly don't know which option scares me more. All I can say is, if you're ever alone in the subway late at night and you hear something that sounds too big to be human moving in the shadows, run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back. Because there are things lurking in this city that defy explanation, things with glowing red eyes and an appetite for human flesh. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. I still have nightmares about that night. In my dreams, I'm back on that platform, paralyzed with fear as the monstrous pit bull turns its bloody muzzle towards me. Sometimes I wake up just as its jaws are about to close around my throat. Other times, the dream shifts, and I'm trapped in that tiny bathroom again, listening to the door splinter as the creature tries to break through. The worst part is, I can never be sure if they're just dreams or memories of what really happened. The line between reality and nightmare has become blurred for me. Every unexplained sound makes me jump. Every shadow seems to hide some lurking menace. I've tried therapy, but it's hard to work through trauma that no one else believes is real. How do you process an encounter with something that shouldn't exist? The therapist tried to convince me it was all a stress-induced hallucination brought on by my breakup and too much alcohol. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The sheer primal terror of being hunted by that thing. That's not something you can imagine or hallucinate. I've become obsessed with trying to find any shred of evidence that might validate my experience. I've spent countless hours scouring news reports for any bizarre animal attacks or unexplained disappearances in the subway system. I've read every urban legend and creepypasta I can find about monsters lurking in the tunnels beneath New York. But nothing quite matches what I saw. The closest I've come to finding anything similar is an obscure forum thread where someone claimed to have seen a devil dog in an abandoned subway station late one night. But the post was years old and the account had been deleted. It's probably nothing, but sometimes I lie awake wondering about that poster. Did they see the same thing I did? What happened to them? I know how crazy all of this sounds. Believe me, there are times I wish I could convince myself it was just a hallucination or a vivid nightmare. Life would be so much easier if I could just forget about that night and move on. But I can't. The memory is burned into my brain, as real and visceral as any other experience I've ever had. So I'm left with this gnawing uncertainty, this constant state of hypervigilance. Every time I step outside, especially after dark, I'm on high alert. My eyes constantly scan my surroundings, looking for any sign of that monstrous shape. I've all but stopped using public transportation. Even walking down the street, I'm always listening for the click of claws on pavement. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. That one encounter shattered my perception of reality and showed me that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting to prey on the unwary. So I'm sharing my story as a warning. Be careful out there, especially in those liminal spaces like empty subway stations late at night. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, get out of there. And if you ever see glowing red eyes staring at you from the darkness, don't hesitate. Run. Run for your life and pray it isn't already too late. Because once you've seen what's really out there, you can never go back to blissful ignorance. The veil has been lifted and the monsters are all too real. All we can do is stay vigilant and hope we never cross paths with them again. It was supposed to be just another urban exploration adventure for me, Adrian, and Randy. We'd been friends since college and bonded over our shared love of exploring abandoned places. We'd check out old factories, hospitals, whatever we could find, but we'd never encountered anything like what was waiting for us in those tunnels. We'd heard rumors about an unfinished subway system beneath parts of Massachusetts. Supposedly construction had started decades ago, but was abandoned partway through for some reason. Adrian had done some digging online and found what he thought were the coordinates for one of the entrance points. It was a crisp fall day when we drove out there, way out in the middle of nowhere. We had to hike through dense woods for almost an hour before we found what looked like an old maintenance shaft, half hidden by overgrown vegetation. My heart was racing with excitement as Adrian pried open the rusty door. The air that wafted out was damp and musty. We switched on our headlamps and peered down into the darkness. A metal ladder descended into blackness. Randy went first, then me, then Adrian bringing up the rear. The climb down seemed to take forever. By the time my feet hit solid ground, I couldn't even see the faint light from the entrance above anymore. We were in a narrow concrete passageway that stretched off in both directions, railway tracks running down the middle. "Holy shit, we actually found it," Adrian whispered, his voice echoing slightly. We started making our way down the tunnel, our footsteps and the crunch of loose gravel unnervingly loud in the stillness. Every so often we'd pass alcoves or side passages branching off. Some had old equipment or supplies scattered about, rotting wooden crates, rusted tools, things like that. After walking for maybe 15 minutes, we came to a larger cavern area. It looked like it was meant to be a station platform eventually. There were half-finished support columns and piles of construction materials. "Let's take a break here and get some pictures," Randy suggested. We sat down on some cinder blocks and broke out our water bottles. I was taking some shots of the creepy shadows cast by our lights when Adrian called out, "Guys, come check this out." He was crouched near one of the walls, shining his light on something. As I got closer, I realized with a jolt that it was a pile of bones. Animal bones, thankfully, but still unsettling. They looked gnawed on, with bits of fur and dried flesh still clinging to some. "What the hell?" Randy muttered. We found more bones scattered around, along with what looked disturbingly like large piles of animal droppings. Whatever was leaving them had to be big. "Maybe we should head back," I said uneasily. This doesn't feel right. But Adrian and Randy wanted to press on, curiosity overriding caution. I reluctantly agreed, though my skin was crawling. We continued deeper into the tunnel system. The air felt heavier somehow, and I could have sworn the temperature was dropping. We passed more piles of bones and waste. Some of the bones looked disturbingly human-like. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. "What was that?" Randy hissed. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again, closer this time. And then the sound of something large moving in the darkness ahead. "Run!" Adrian yelled. We took off sprinting back the way we came. I could hear heavy footfalls and panting breaths behind us, getting closer. My lungs were burning as I ran faster than I ever had in my life. We reached a fork in the tunnels, and Randy went left while Adrian and I went right. I glanced back and caught a glimpse of something massive and pale in the beam of my headlamp before it ducked into the shadows. Adrian and I kept running until we couldn't anymore, collapsing against a wall and gasping for air. We didn't hear anything pursuing us anymore. "Randy," Adrian panted. "We have to go back for him." My whole body was shaking. "Are you insane? We barely got away from that thing." "We can't just leave him," Adrian insisted. Before I could argue further, we heard Randy's voice echoing faintly. "Help! Over here!" We followed the sound, moving as quietly as we could. We found Randy in another unfinished station area, crouched behind some crates. "Thank God," he whispered as we approached. "I think I lost it, but—" He was cut off by an ear-splitting roar that filled the cavernous space. Our lights caught movement as something huge lunged from the shadows. I caught only glimpses as we ran for our lives. Pale, leathery skin, long limbs, too many teeth. It was right behind us, so close I could feel its hot breath. We rounded a corner, and I saw the ladder up ahead. Adrian reached it first and scrambled up. I was next, my hands slipping on the rungs in my panic. Randy was last. As he started to climb, a clawed hand shot out of the darkness and caught his leg. He screamed as it started to drag him back. Adrian and I each grabbed one of Randy's arms, pulling with all our strength. For a terrifying moment I thought we'd lose him, but then whatever had him let go, and Randy practically flew up the ladder. We burst out of that maintenance hatch into the fading evening light, slamming the door behind us. We ran through the woods until we reached Adrian's car, not stopping until we were speeding down the highway. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? We'd barely escaped with our lives from some kind of monster living in those tunnels. Even now, months later, I have trouble believing it really happened, but I know it did. The nightmares and Randy's scars are proof enough. I don't know what that creature was, or why those tunnels were really abandoned. Part of me wants to go to the authorities, but who would believe us? And what if they went down there and more people got hurt or killed? So I'm sharing this story anonymously, as a warning. Those tunnels are out there, and something horrible lives in them. If you ever hear rumors about an unfinished subway system in Massachusetts, stay far away. Some places are meant to stay buried and forgotten. I only wish we had realized that before it was almost too late. I'll never forget that summer afternoon when I was 11. It started out like any other day, just me and my best friend Tommy hanging out and exploring the fields near our neighborhood. We loved wandering through the tall grass, looking for cool bugs or interesting rocks. The sun was beating down and cicadas were buzzing in the trees. Everything felt normal and safe. But then I got this weird feeling, like we were being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw him, a man crouching behind a hay bale about 50 feet away. He was staring right at us with this creepy intensity. My heart started racing and I felt sick to my stomach. Who was this guy and why was he hiding and watching us? I tried to act normal so Tommy wouldn't freak out, but I was panicking inside. The guy was dressed all in black despite the heat. He had on a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Something about him just felt so wrong and predatory. I whispered to Tommy that we should head back home, trying to keep my voice steady. But as we started walking away, I saw the man begin to move out from behind the hay bale. He was going to follow us. I knew we couldn't outrun an adult. We were in serious danger. That's when an idea popped into my head. It was risky, but I had to try something. I pulled out my cell phone and pretended to make a call. In a loud voice, I said, "Hey, Dad. Yeah, we're out in the field by Miller's farm. You know where you always do target practice? Okay, see you in a few minutes." Tommy looked at me confused, but I gave him a look to play along. I kept fake talking, mentioning how my dad was a police officer and how he'd be there any minute to pick us up. The whole time, I was watching the man out of the corner of my eye. It worked. As soon as I mentioned my police officer dad, the creepy guy's whole demeanor changed. He started backing away slowly, then turned and ran full speed into the woods. I've never been so relieved in my life. Once he was gone, I explained everything to Tommy. We booked it home as fast as we could and told our parents what happened. They called the real police, but they never found the guy. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about what might have happened if I hadn't thought quickly. Who was that man? What did he want with us? The thoughts still make my skin crawl over 15 years later. I've replayed that afternoon in my mind countless times. The golden sunlight on the grass, the fresh hay smell in the air, the stark contrast of that sinister figure in black. It was like a bubble of evil had intruded into our innocent childhood world. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined or exaggerated parts of it. But then I remember the cold dread I felt when I first spotted him watching us. The predatory way he started to emerge once we tried to leave. The instant change when he thought my dad was coming. No, it was all too real. I'm still not sure what that man's intentions were. Best case, maybe he was just some weirdo getting his kicks by scaring kids. Worst case, I don't even want to think about it. I'm just grateful my quick thinking scared him off. That experience changed me. I became much more cautious and aware of my surroundings after that day. I started taking self-defense classes. To this day, I'm hyper-vigilant about watching for potential threats, especially when I'm with my own kids. I've wondered over the years if that man ever hurt anyone else. Did he move on to another town to prey on children there? Or did my fake call scare him straight? I'll never know. But I hope that by sharing my story, I can help other kids learn to trust their instincts and stay safe. Looking back, I'm proud of how I handled the situation. But I also feel angry that two innocent kids had to deal with such a terrifying threat. No child should have to come up with elaborate lies just to stay safe while playing outside. The randomness of it all still haunts me sometimes. One minute we were just goofing around without a care in the world. The next, we were in potential mortal danger. It really drove home how quickly life can change and how important it is to always be prepared. I still love nature and the outdoors, but I'll never again feel that carefree innocence I had before that day. There's always a part of my brain on alert now, scanning for hidden threats. It's sad in a way, but it's kept me and my loved ones safe. To this day, I tense up when I see a lone man watching children play. It's probably unfair most of the time. But that experience taught me that predators can look just like anyone else. You truly never know someone's intentions. I'm sharing this story now in hopes that it might help someone else stay safe. Trust your gut instincts. Be aware of your surroundings. Have an escape plan. Don't be afraid to make a scene if you feel threatened. A little quick thinking can make all the difference. To any parents reading this, please talk to your kids about stranger danger and what to do in scary situations. I'm so glad my parents had those conversations with me. Without that knowledge, who knows what might have happened that day. It's been years, but I can still picture every detail of that man, his grubby clothes, his intense stare, the way he moved. Those images are seared into my brain forever. But I try not to dwell on the what-ifs. Instead, I focus on being grateful that we escaped unharmed. I hope that creep never hurt anyone else. But realistically, someone that brazen was probably a habitual predator. It makes me sick to think about. I've considered hypnosis to try to recall more details that might help identify him. But part of me is afraid of what memories that might unearth. Sometimes I still have nightmares where I'm back in that field. Only in the dreams, my plan doesn't work. The man grabs us, and I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. Those nights, I go check on my sleeping children and hug them extra tight. I've become that parent who some might call overprotective. But until you've looked true evil in the face like that, you can't understand. I'll gladly be called paranoid if it means keeping my family safe from monsters like that man. If there's one silver lining, it's that the experience brought Tommy and I closer together. Going through something so intense created a lifelong bond. We don't talk about that day much, but when we do, there's a depth of understanding there. So that's my story. A normal summer day turned into a lifelong trauma in the blink of an eye. I hope it serves as a reminder to always stay vigilant and trust your instincts. You never know when danger might be lurking just out of sight. We'd driven down from Illinois to stay at my uncle's lakeside cabin for a week. I was excited to get away from the city and spend some time out on the water. The first couple days were pretty uneventful, just relaxing, fishing, and enjoying nature. But on the third day, everything changed. We got up early that morning to head out on the lake. It was foggy and the water was like glass. As we motored out to our usual fishing spot, I noticed something odd in the distance. At first I thought it was just a partially submerged log or something, but as we got closer, I realized it was moving. "Dad, do you see that?" I asked, pointing towards the strange shape in the water about 50 yards away. He squinted and shook his head. "I don't see anything, Bud. Where are you looking?" But before I could explain, the log suddenly rose up out of the water. My jaw dropped as I saw a long, snake-like neck emerge, followed by a small head. It towered at least 15 feet above the surface. I started frantically tapping my dad's arm. "There, right there. Do you see it now?" He turned just as the creature's head swiveled in our direction. For a split second, its eyes locked with mine. They were dark and intelligent-looking. A chill ran down my spine. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature plunged back beneath the surface with barely a splash. The water churned for a moment before going still again. I was shaking. Did you see that?" I stammered. My dad looked confused and concerned. "See what?" I didn't see anything unusual. The monster! It was huge, like the Loch Ness monster or something. I was practically yelling at this point. "Whoa, calm down," my dad said. "I think the fog is playing tricks on your eyes. There's no monster out here." But I knew what I'd seen. It was burned into my memory. We spent another hour fishing, but I couldn't focus. I kept scanning the water nervously, half expecting the creature to resurface at any moment. When we got back to the cabin, I tried to tell my uncle about it. He just laughed and ruffled my hair. "You've got quite an imagination, kiddo, but there ain't no lake monsters around these parts." I was frustrated that no one believed me. I knew I wasn't imagining things. What I'd seen was real. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that long neck rising from the water, those piercing eyes staring into mine. I tossed and turned for hours before finally drifting off. I woke with a start around 3 a.m. At first I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, a low, mournful sound coming from the direction of the lake. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite a roar, not quite a moan. It sent shivers down my spine. I crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the water. And there, about 100 yards offshore, I saw it again. The long neck, the small head silhouetted against the moonlight. It was real, and it was back. I wanted to wake my dad, to make him see. But I was frozen in place, unable to look away. The creature slowly turned its head, scanning the shoreline. Then it let out another of those haunting calls before sinking back into the depths. I stood there for what felt like hours, heart pounding, waiting to see if it would return. But the lake remained still and silent for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried again to convince my dad and uncle of what I'd seen. They exchanged worried glances. "Maybe we should cut the trip short," my dad suggested. "I think all this fresh air is going to your head." I was indignant. "I'm not crazy. It was there, I swear." But it was no use. We packed up and left that afternoon. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about the creature. What was it? Where did it come from? Why hadn't anyone else ever reported seeing it? In the years since, I've done a lot of research. I've read about other lake monster sightings around the world. I've studied cryptozoology and theories about undiscovered species. But I've never found a satisfactory explanation for what I saw that summer. I'm 28 now, and I've never been back to that lake. Part of me wants to return, to try to gather evidence, but another part of me is scared of what I might find. What if it's still out there, lurking beneath the surface? What if it remembers me? Sometimes I wonder if I really did imagine the whole thing. If the fog and the darkness and an overactive teenage imagination combined to create a false memory. But then I remember those eyes, that haunting call in the night, and I know it was real. I've tried to talk about it a few times over the years, but people always react with skepticism or concern for my mental health. So mostly I keep it to myself now. But I know what I saw. And I'll never forget that summer when I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. I still have nightmares sometimes. I'm back on that lake, and the water starts to churn. That long neck rises up, getting closer and closer. Those eyes lock onto mine. But this time, it doesn't retreat. This time, it keeps coming. I always wake up in a cold sweat just before it reaches me. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of mutated alligator or snake. Maybe it was a leftover dinosaur somehow preserved in the murky depths. But deep down, I know those explanations don't fit. What I saw was something other, something not of this world. I've often wondered why I was the only one who saw it. Was I chosen for some reason? Or was it just random chance that I happened to be looking in the right direction at the right moment? And why didn't it show itself to my dad when I tried to point it out? There are so many unanswered questions. Sometimes I think about reaching out to cryptozoologists or monster hunters, sharing my story and seeing if anyone would be willing to investigate. But then I imagine them traipsing around the lake, disturbing whatever's down there. And I worry, what if they found it? What if they captured it or killed it? Somehow that seems wrong, like it would be violating some natural order. So I keep my secret. I go about my daily life, working my office job, hanging out with friends, living a normal existence. But always in the back of my mind, there's that memory, that knowledge that the world is stranger and more mysterious than most people realize. I've never seen anything like it since, despite going on many other outdoor trips and vacations. It was a once-in-a-lifetime encounter. Sometimes I'm grateful for that. Other times, I long to see it again, to prove to myself and the world that I'm not crazy. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at a lake the same way again. Every time I'm near water, I find myself scanning the surface, half expecting to see that sinuous neck rise up. It hasn't happened yet, but who knows? Maybe someday, when I least expect it, I'll come face to face with the unknown once more. Until then, I'll keep this story mostly to myself, but I know what I saw that summer in Louisiana. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the day I saw the impossible become real. The drive up was beautiful, winding mountain roads with breathtaking views. We arrived Friday evening just as the sun was setting. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with a fireplace and big windows looking out at the forest. That first night was actually really nice. We had some drinks, played cards, and just relaxed. If only things had stayed that way. Everything changed on Saturday morning. I woke up early and decided to explore the cabin a bit while Mark and Lisa were still asleep. In one of the bedrooms, I found this old leather-bound journal tucked away in the nightstand. It looked ancient, the pages yellow and brittle. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started flipping through it. The journal entries were bizarre, to say the least. They were dated from the 1920s and seemed to be written by the original owner of the cabin. At first, it was just mundane stuff about building the place and living in the mountains. But as I read on, things got darker. The writer started rambling about hearing voices in the woods, seeing shadowy figures outside the windows at night. They became more and more paranoid, convinced something evil was lurking in the forest, trying to get inside. I know I should have just put the journal away, but I couldn't stop reading. The final entry chilled me to the bone. They're here. God help me. They've found a way in. If anyone finds this, get out while you still can. Don't let them. And that was it. The rest of the pages were blank. I closed the journal, feeling uneasy. I told myself it was just the ramblings of some isolated hermit who went crazy from the solitude. But I couldn't shake this creeping sense of dread. When Mark and Lisa woke up, I showed them the journal. Mark seemed fascinated by it, but Lisa got a weird look on her face, like she was scared. We all laughed it off as some old ghost story, but there was tension in the air. That afternoon we decided to go for a hike to clear our heads. The forest was beautiful, but something felt off. It was too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence. I kept getting the feeling we were being watched. About an hour into our hike, Mark said he forgot something at the cabin and wanted to go back. Lisa and I decided to keep going and meet him back there later. That was the last time we saw him. When we got back to the cabin a couple hours later, There was no sign of Mark. His car was still there, but he was just gone. We called out for him, searched the cabin, looked around outside. Nothing. As the sun started to set, panic set in. We debated trying to hike out to get help, but it was getting dark fast and we didn't know the area well. That's when the whispering started. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it sounded like voices. Unintelligible, but definitely voices. They seemed to be coming from all around us, from inside the walls of the cabin itself. Lisa was freaking out, saying we needed to leave right away. But when we tried to start her car, it wouldn't turn over. We were stuck. We barricaded ourselves inside the cabin as night fell. The whispering got louder, more insistent. I swear I could make out words sometimes, but nothing that made sense. Just fragments like, "Join us and never leave." We huddled together in the living room, too terrified to sleep. Around midnight, we heard footsteps on the porch, heavy, dragging footsteps. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The doorknob started to turn slowly. Lisa let out a strangled scream, but the door was locked. Whatever was out there couldn't get in. The footsteps retreated, but I knew it wasn't over. As the night wore on, things only got worse. Shadows moved across the walls, even though there was nothing casting them. The temperature dropped so low we could see our breath. That damn whispering never stopped. At one point, I thought I saw Mark outside one of the windows, but it couldn't have been him. The face was twisted, inhuman. When I blinked, it was gone. I don't know how we made it through the night. When dawn finally broke, the voices faded and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Lisa's car miraculously started, and we got the hell out of there as fast as we could. We never found Mark. The police searched the area but turned up nothing. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about that cabin. Lisa won't talk about it at all. I've tried to convince myself it was all just stress and an overactive imagination, but deep down, I know what we experienced was real. Sometimes I wonder about that journal, still sitting in the nightstand drawer. Part of me wants to go back, to try to uncover the truth about what happened. But a bigger part of me is terrified of what I might find. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, lurking in the dark places, and sometimes they find us. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over a year now. We had just moved to this small town in Iowa from Chicago, and I was feeling pretty bummed about leaving all my friends behind. My parents kept saying it would be a fresh start for our family, but to 16-year-old me, it just felt like my life was over. The first few weeks were rough. I didn't know anyone, and the town was so quiet compared to the city. I spent most of my time holed up in my room playing video games. But then my mom suggested I go visit my grandparents, who lived on the outskirts of town. She thought it might cheer me up. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when I rode my bike over to their place. The sun was starting to set as I pedaled down the long gravel driveway lined with cornfields. My grandparents' old farmhouse came into view, looking exactly the same as it had the last time we visited years ago. I propped my bike against the porch and was about to knock when I noticed the note taped to the door. It was from my grandma, saying they had run into town for groceries but would be back soon. She told me to make myself at home and that there were sodas in the fridge. With a shrug, I let myself in and grabbed a Coke from the kitchen. I flopped down on the old plaid couch in the living room, scrolling through my phone as I waited. The house was so quiet, I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. After about 20 minutes, I was starting to get antsy. I decided to step outside for some fresh air and to see if I could spot my grandparents' car coming down the road. The sun had almost set by then, casting long shadows across the yard. A cool breeze rustled through the cornfields. I walked around to the back of the house, sipping my soda and kicking at the gravel. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the fading light. But as I squinted into the shadows at the edge of the woods behind the house, my blood ran cold. There was something standing there, something tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet high. I froze in place, my heart pounding. The thing was so pale it seemed to glow faintly in the twilight. Its skin looked wrong somehow, too smooth, almost plastic-like. It didn't move at all, just stood there perfectly still. I couldn't make out any facial features in the shadows, but I had the overwhelming sensation that it was staring right at me. A part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. I don't know how long we stood there locked in that silent standoff. It felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Suddenly a car door slammed in the front yard. I heard my grandma call out, "Jake, you here, sweetie?" I whipped my head around towards her voice, my heart leaping into my throat. When I looked back, the thing was gone. My legs finally unlocked, and I sprinted around to the front of the house, nearly colliding with my grandpa as he carried in grocery bags. "Whoa there, sport. What's got you in such a hurry?" he chuckled. I was gasping for air, trying to form words. There was, in the woods. My grandma came over, concern etched on her face. "Jake, honey, you're white as a sheet. What happened?" I managed to stammer out what I'd seen. As I described the creature, my grandparents exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. "Oh, sweetie, I'm sure it was just shadows playing tricks on you," my grandma said soothingly, but there was a tremor in her voice. My grandpa cleared his throat. "Why don't you come on inside? I'll make us some hot chocolate." I followed them into the house on shaky legs, glancing nervously over my shoulder. As we sat around the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a steaming mug, my grandparents tried to distract me with stories about my dad's childhood antics. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air, like they were choosing their words carefully. When my mom came to pick me up later that evening, I was still pretty shaken. She must have noticed because she kept shooting me concerned glances on the drive home. "Everything okay, Jake? Did you have a good time with Grandma and Grandpa?" I hesitated, then blurted out, "Mom, I saw something weird in the woods behind their house." Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Weird how?" I described the creature again, its impossible height, that unsettling pale skin, the way it had just stood there watching me. To my shock, my mom's face drained of color. "Mom, what's wrong?" She was quiet for a long moment, then said in a low voice, "Jake, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What you saw, your father and I have seen it too." My jaw dropped. "What? When?" She sighed heavily. "It was years ago, before you were born. We were visiting your grandparents for Christmas. Your dad and I went for a walk in the woods and, well, we saw exactly what you described." A chill ran down my spine. "Did you tell anyone?" "We told your grandparents. They said it's been spotted around there for generations. They call it the Ravenreap's creature." "Ravenreap's creature?" I echoed. Mom nodded. "Apparently it's an old local legend. No one knows what it is or where it came from. It just appears sometimes, watching people from the shadows. It's never hurt anyone as far as anyone knows. It just watches." I felt sick to my stomach. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" "We hoped you'd never have to know," she said softly. "We thought maybe it was gone for good." It's been years since anyone reported a sighting. The rest of the drive passed in tense silence. When we got home, my dad was waiting up for us. One look at our faces, and he knew something was wrong. "He saw it," my mom said simply. Dad's face went pale. He came over and put his hands on my shoulders, looking me in the eye. "Are you okay, son?" I nodded numbly. "Yeah, I think so, just freaked out." We stayed up late into the night, my parents telling me everything they knew about the creature, which, honestly, wasn't much. Just bits and pieces of local folklore passed down through generations. Some said it was an alien. Others thought it was some kind of cryptid or undiscovered species. A few even believed it was a ghost or demon. All anyone knew for sure was that it had been seen in that area for at least 100 years. Always the same description: impossibly tall, pale skin, featureless face, and always just watching, never interacting. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about those moments in my grandparents' backyard. The absolute stillness of the creature, the prickling sensation of being watched. But more than that, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That somehow, seeing the Raven Reap's creature had set something in motion. Like I was now part of something bigger and stranger than I could imagine. In the years since then, I haven't seen the creature again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods or walking home late at night, I get that same skin-crawling feeling of being watched. I've done some digging, trying to find out more about the legend. But there's surprisingly little information out there. Just vague stories and second-hand accounts. I did find one thing, though. An old newspaper clipping from the 1950s about a group of kids who went missing in the woods near my grandparents' property. They were found 3 days later, physically unharmed but badly shaken. When interviewed, all they would say was that they had seen the pale man watching them from the trees. They refused to go into the woods ever again. I don't know what the Raven Reap's creature is or what it wants. Maybe it's just a local boogeyman, a story blown out of proportion over the years. But then I remember those moments in the backyard, the impossible height, the unnatural stillness, those empty shadows where a face should be. And I know deep in my bones that what I saw was real, that it's still out there, watching and waiting. For what? I don't know. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear something moving in the woods behind our house. Something big. And I lie awake, wondering if tonight will be the night it decides to do more than just watch. After stewing in my room for hours, I decided I'd show them. I waited until late that night when I was sure they were asleep. Then I quietly slipped on my shoes, grabbed a flashlight, and snuck out the back door. Our house backed up to a dense forest, and I figured I'd go for a little nighttime adventure to blow off some steam. The cool night air felt refreshing as I made my way into the woods. At first, I stuck close to the edge where I could still see the lights from nearby houses. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I got bolder. I ventured deeper into the forest, using my flashlight to navigate around fallen logs and branches. After walking for maybe 20 minutes, I came to a small clearing. That's when I saw it, an odd-looking tree trunk standing alone in the middle of the open space. Something about it immediately caught my attention. It was wider than the other trees and had a strange, twisted shape. The bark looked almost leathery in the beam of my flashlight. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved closer to investigate. As I approached, I noticed faint grooves and patterns etched into the surface of the trunk. They almost looked like faces. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't look away. I reached out to touch the strange bark. The moment my fingers made contact, I felt the trunk shudder beneath my hand. Before I could even process what was happening, the entire thing started to move. The twisted shape began to unfurl and stretch upwards. I stumbled backwards in shock as the tree rose to tower over me. In the dim light, I could make out long, branch-like appendages unfurling from its body. But they weren't branches at all. They were grotesque, gnarled limbs ending in razor-sharp claws. The faces I'd seen in the bark came to life, contorting into horrifying expressions. Dozens of eyes blinked open all over its body, focusing on me with predatory intensity. I was frozen in terror as the monstrous creature loomed over me. Its mouth, if you could call it that, split open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. An otherworldly shriek filled the air as it lunged towards me with terrifying speed. In that moment, I was absolutely certain I was about to die. I squeezed my eyes shut and braced for the attack, but it never came. Instead, I heard the deafening crack of a gunshot echo through the forest. My eyes flew open just in time to see the creature recoil, letting out an ear-splitting howl of pain. "Run!" a familiar voice shouted. I turned to see my dad emerge from the shadows, wielding his old hunting rifle. He fired another shot at the beast as he raced towards me. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted back the way I had come, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear my dad right behind me, pausing occasionally to fire off another round at the pursuing monster. We tore through the forest at breakneck speed, branches whipping at our faces. The creature's unearthly shrieks seemed to come from all around us. I was terrified to look back, afraid of what I might see gaining on us. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we finally burst out of the tree line behind our house. My mom was standing on the back porch, wide-eyed with panic. "Inside now," my dad yelled as we raced across the yard. We practically dove through the door, slamming and locking it behind us. My dad immediately started barricading the entrance with furniture, while my mom checked me over for injuries. I was shaking uncontrollably, still unable to process what had just happened. We huddled together in the living room for the rest of the night, jumping at every little sound. My dad kept his rifle at the ready, but nothing came for us. As the first rays of dawn began to peek through the windows, we finally started to relax a little. Over coffee, my parents gently asked me to explain what had happened. I haltingly recounted my reckless nighttime excursion and the horrifying encounter in the woods. To my surprise, they didn't yell or punish me further. They just listened with grave expressions. When I finished, my dad let out a heavy sigh. "I was afraid something like this might happen someday," he said cryptically. He went on to explain that there had always been strange legends about those woods, stories of hikers going missing and eerie sounds in the night. He dismissed them as local superstition, but now, within a week, my parents had decided we needed to move. They said it was for a job opportunity, but I knew the real reason. As we drove away from our home for the last time, I caught a glimpse of the forest's edge. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a twisted shape watching us from the shadows. It's been years now, but I still have nightmares about that night. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, imagining I can hear that inhuman shriek echoing in the distance. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild in the dark. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I never snuck out again after that, and I gained a newfound appreciation for my parents. If my dad hadn't come looking for me that night, I shudder to think what might have happened. These days, I steer clear of forests at night. And I always keep a watchful eye on the trees, because you never know what might be lurking just beneath the bark, waiting to reveal its true nature.